Chapter 1. Bones Beneath the Altar. In the summer of 2019, construction workers renovating the ancient convent of Santa Chiara in Florence made a discovery that would chill the blood of anyone who heard it. Behind a wall that had stood for over 500 years, they found the skeleton of a young woman, seated upright as if she had been walled in alive. Her bony fingers still clutched stone tablets covered in carved text, words scratched with desperate precision into the rock. The inscription, barely legible after centuries of darkness, read simply, "I am Caterina. I loved, I lived, remember me." But this is not where our story begins. To understand how a woman came to die scratching her defiance into stone, we must travel back to a Florence very different from the Renaissance jewel tourists admire today. We must go back to 1498, when the city trembled under the iron fist of religious extremism, when beauty was considered sin and pleasure was punishable by death. We must go back to the day when Alessandra Strozzi died and Sister Caterina was born. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the Palazzo Strozzi as 19-year-old Alessandra knelt before her father's chair, her golden hair catching the light like spun metal. She was beautiful in the way that Renaissance painters dreamed of capturing. Intelligent eyes that missed nothing, a mouth that curved with wit even in moments of despair, hands that moved with the grace of someone born to luxury but possessed of a mind sharp enough to survive its loss. Marco Strozzi, once one of Florence's wealthiest merchants, now sat broken in his counting room, surrounded by ledgers that told the story of his ruin. The economic collapse that followed Lorenzo de' Medici's death had devastated families like his, those who had invested everything in the stability of Medici power, only to watch it crumble along with their fortunes. The silk trade that had made the Strozzi name synonymous with wealth had withered under political instability and foreign competition. The palazzo that had once hosted the greatest minds of Florence now echoed with emptiness, its treasures sold piece by piece to pay crushing debts. Alessandra understood the mathematics of her situation with brutal clarity. A noble daughter required a dowry befitting her station, thousands of florins that her father simply did not possess. Without a dowry, she could not marry within her class. Without marriage, she was a burden her family could not afford to bear. The solution was as old as Christianity itself. Give the unwanted daughter to God, and let the church bear the cost of her maintenance. "The convent of Santa Chiara has agreed to accept you," Marco said, his voice hollow with defeat. "The donation required is manageable. You will be safe there, federal protected." The words came slowly, as if each one caused him physical pain. He could not meet her eyes as he spoke them, this man who had once commanded merchant fleets and negotiated with princes, now reduced to selling his daughter's freedom for the price of his survival. Alessandra had known this moment was coming. She had watched her mother's jewellery disappear, had seen the servants dismissed one by one, had felt the walls of their world contracting around them like a fist slowly closing. She had also done something her father did not know. She had educated herself. While he spent his days with moneylenders and creditors, she had haunted the palazzo's library, reading everything she could find about law, about property, about the rights and restrictions that governed women's lives. She understood better than he did that once she entered Santa Chiara, she would cease to exist as Alessandra Strozzi. She would become property of the church, a bride of Christ with no legal standing, no inheritance rights, no freedom to leave or choose her own path. But she also understood something else, something that burned in her chest like a coal refusing to be extinguished. She understood that intelligence was a weapon, that beauty was a tool, and that even in the most restrictive circumstances, a clever woman could carve out spaces of power and freedom. The convent might think it was acquiring a penitent daughter seeking spiritual salvation. Instead, it was about to receive a woman who had already decided that if she could not live freely, she would at least live on her own terms. The ceremony took place on a grey October morning, when fog rose from the Arno like the breath of ghosts. The ancient church attached to Santa Chiara Convent had witnessed thousands of such rituals. Young women transformed from daughters into brides of Christ, their earthly identities dissolved in holy water and black wool, but few had entered those sacred walls with eyes as calculating as Alessandra's, or with a mind already working to decode the weaknesses in the system that sought to contain her. Mother Superior Suor Margherita presided over the transformation with the cold efficiency of a woman who had performed this ritual countless times. She was perhaps 50, with the grey pallor of someone who had spent decades without sunlight, her face carved into permanent lines of disapproval by years of finding sin in every human pleasure. As she lifted the black veil that would cover Alessandra's hair forever, she spoke the words that were meant to represent spiritual rebirth. "You are dead to the world, child. Today you are born again in Christ as Sister Caterina." The silk wedding dress, the one Alessandra would never wear to marry a living husband, was stripped away with ceremonial precision. In its place came the rough wool habit of the Franciscan order, coarse against skin accustomed to fine fabrics, heavy with the weight of imposed humility. The golden hair that had been her pride was shorn short and covered with a white coif, then the black veil that would mark her as property of the church for the rest of her natural life. But as the veil descended over her face, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the submission the ceremony was designed to create, Alessandra felt a strange sense of liberation. The woman who'd been vulnerable as a daughter, subject to her father's financial desperation and society's matrimonial marketplace, was dying. In her place was being born someone new, someone who owed nothing to family expectations or social conventions, someone who could create her own identity within these walls. Sister Caterina, for that was who she would be now, looked around the chapel with the eyes that catalogued everything. She noted the worn stones that suggested hidden passages behind the walls, the way certain areas of flooring sounded hollow underfoot, the subtle differences in masonry that indicated centuries of renovations and reconstructions. She observed which nuns avoided eye contact and which watched with obvious curiosity, which seemed broken by their captivity and which had found ways to thrive within it. Most importantly, she studied the men who held power in this female space. The priest who performed the ceremony, the confessor who would hear her supposed sins, the various officials and patrons who moved through the convent with the casual authority of those who controlled women's lives without being subject to their restrictions. These men saw nuns as either saints or sinners, either pure vessels for divine grace or corrupted vessels in need of punishment. None of them expected to encounter a woman who understood that survival required becoming neither saint nor sinner, but something far more dangerous, a strategist. The other novices who entered Santa Chiara that day wept as they spoke their vows, mourning the lives they would never live, the children they would never bear, the freedom they were surrendering forever. Caterina spoke the same words with a clear voice and steady hands, but she was not mourning, she was planning. As the ceremony concluded and the newly made sisters were led to their cells, Caterina committed every detail of the building's layout to memory. She noted which doors were locked and which merely closed, which corridors saw regular traffic and which seemed forgotten by daily routine. She memorized the schedule of prayers and meals, the rhythm of convent life that would provide the framework within which she would have to operate. Most crucially, she began to understand that this ancient building, constructed and reconstructed over centuries, almost certainly contained spaces that existed between the official architecture, spaces that could be discovered by someone with the intelligence to look for them and the courage to use them. The cell they assigned her was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a wooden crucifix, and a small window set too high in the wall to provide any view of the outside world. It was meant to be a place of meditation and prayer, a constant reminder of the simplicity and denial that should characterize religious life. But as Caterina knelt before the crucifix that first night, she was not praying for forgiveness or spiritual guidance. She was making a promise to herself, a vow more binding than any she had spoken in the chapel. She would not disappear into this place. She would not allow her intelligence to atrophy or her beauty to fade unappreciated. She would not spend her life in genuine repentance for the sin of being born female in a world that saw women as commodities to be traded between fathers and husbands or disposed of in religious institutions. Instead, that she would find ways to live fully within these walls, to experience everything that had been forbidden to her, to claim the pleasures and freedoms that society insisted belonged only to men. The irony was not lost on her that in forcing her into this supposed sanctuary of virtue, her father had actually provided her with the perfect cover for vice. The world outside these walls would never look too closely at the private lives of enclosed nuns, assuming that religious vows and physical barriers were sufficient to prevent any serious transgression. The very completeness of her supposed separation from the world would make it easiest to hide the ways she intended to remain very much part of it. As the bells of Santa Chiara rang compline that first night, marking the end of her last day as Alessandra Strozzi and the beginning of her new life as Sister Caterina, she lay on the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the building settling around her. Ancient stones creaked and whispered, and she could swear she heard footsteps in corridors that should have been empty, voices speaking in chambers that were not supposed to exist. The convent was old, and old buildings kept secrets. She intended to discover every one of them. The construction workers who found her bones 5 centuries later would never know that they had discovered the remains of a woman who succeeded beyond her wildest dreams in living exactly as she chose. They would see only the evidence of medieval cruelty, a young woman walled up alive for crimes they could only guess at. But if they had been able to read the full story carved into those stone tablets, they would have learned about something far more complex and dangerous than simple victimhood. They would have learned about a woman who turned a prison into a kingdom, who transformed religious vows into cover for the most elaborate deception in Florentine history, who loved and was loved by some of the most powerful men of her age while maintaining the fiction of virginal devotion to God. They would have discovered that sometimes the most effective rebellion is the one that operates entirely within the system it seeks to subvert, using the oppressor's own assumptions and prejudices as weapons against the oppression itself. But all of that was still to come. On that first night in 1498, she was simply Sister Caterina, newest resident of Santa Chiara, Convent, lying in darkness and planning a future that would horrify her captors and inspire anyone who believed that human dignity was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Chapter 2. The Bonfire of Giallos. The morning after Caterina's investiture, Florence woke to the sound of hammers building a platform in the Piazza della Signoria. By noon, the smell of smoke would carry across the city like a plague, and by evening the screams of the burning would echo off ancient stones while crowds cheered for the glory of God. This was Florence under Girolamo Savonarola, where purity was measured in blood and salvation came at the point of a sword. From the high windows of Santa Chiara, the sisters could see the black smoke rising from the centre of the city, though they were forbidden to speak of what it meant. They knew, of course. Everyone in Florence knew. The Dominican friar who claimed to speak with the voice of God himself had declared war on human pleasure, and the bonfires that consumed books and artwork and mirrors were merely the beginning. Soon they would consume human flesh as well, and the citizens of the greatest city of the Renaissance would dance around the flames like pagans worshipping some primitive deity of destruction. Caterina pressed her face to the narrow window of her cell and watched the smoke spiral upward into the October sky. She had read Savonarola's sermons, had heard the reports of his prophetic visions, had seen the transformation of Florence from a centre of learning and beauty into something that resembled the apocalyptic fantasies of medieval mystics. The friar preached that God was coming to cleanse Italy of its sins, starting with Florence, and that only those who embraced absolute purity would survive the divine judgment that was surely approaching. What made Savonarola so dangerous was not his religious extremism alone, but the way he had weaponized the economic desperation that gripped Florence after the Medici collapse. When people have lost everything, when their world has dissolved into chaos and uncertainty, they become desperate for someone to blame, someone to punish, some way to make sense of their suffering. Savonarola gave them all three. The sins of the wealthy had brought God's wrath upon the city. The corrupt clergy had betrayed their sacred trust. The women who adorned themselves with beauty were tempting righteous men into damnation. All of it must be purged with fire and blood. Mother Superior Suor Margherita embraced this new severity with the fervour of someone who had always suspected that human pleasure was inherently evil and finally had divine authority for her suspicions. She had been appointed to lead Santa Chiara precisely because of her reputation for harsh discipline, her complete intolerance for any deviation from absolute religious orthodoxy. Under her leadership, the convent had transformed from a place where noble daughters lived in relative comfort while maintaining the fiction of religious devotion into something resembling a prison, where every word was monitored, every action scrutinized, every thought examined for evidence of corruption. The changes began immediately. Meals, already simple, became exercises in deliberate hunger. The thin soup and hard bread that had once been supplemented with occasional luxuries donated by wealthy families was now served without apology or explanation for its inadequacy. Physical comfort became evidence of spiritual weakness. The straw mattresses grew thinner, the cells colder, the daily schedule more punishing in its demand for constant prayer and labour. but it was the psychological terror that proved most effective. Suor Margarita instituted a system of mutual surveillance that turned the nuns against each other with devastating efficiency. Every sister was required to report any signs of worldliness, any evidence of vanity, any suggestion that her fellow religious were failing to embrace the total self-denial that Savonarolan purity demanded. A glance in a mirror, a moment spent arranging one's veil for appearance rather than mere function, a sigh of longing when wedding processions passed the convent gates, all became evidence of spiritual corruption that must be reported, investigated, and punished. The punishments themselves were designed to break both body and spirit. Public flogging for minor infractions, days spent kneeling on stone floors without food or water for more serious offences. For the most serious crimes, those that suggested a sister had retained too much attachment to her former life or harboured thoughts inappropriate to her religious calling, there was the discipline chamber, a windowless cell beneath the convent where women disappeared for weeks at a time and emerged broken in ways that went far beyond physical damage. Caterina observed all of this with the calculating attention of someone studying a new form of warfare. She understood that Suor Margarita's cruelty was not random sadism, but strategic intimidation designed to create absolute compliance through terror. Every public punishment was theatre, every reported transgression was a lesson to the others about the consequences of maintaining any vestige of individual will or desire. The Mother Superior was not just enforcing religious discipline, she was systematically destroying the personalities and identities of the women under her control, reducing them to empty vessels that could be filled only with approved religious sentiment. What made the situation even more sinister was the way Savonarola's influence reached into the convent through visiting clergy and lay officials who came to ensure that Santa Chiara was properly implementing the new standards of purity. These men, and they were always men, arrived with the authority to investigate, interrogate and punish any evidence of insufficiently rigorous religious observance. They examined the convent's financial records to ensure that no money was being spent on unnecessary comfort. They inspected the sisters' cells for evidence of prohibited personal possessions. Most invasively, they conducted private interviews with individual nuns, probing for admissions of impure thoughts, worldly longings, or criticism of the new order. The first of these investigations took place barely a month after Caterina's arrival, when Brother Antonio Salvetti came to Santa Chiara with a mandate to root out any remaining traces of the corrupt luxury that had supposedly characterized religious life before Savonarola's reforms. He was a thin man with the pale skin and nervous energy of someone who spent his days searching for sin in every human expression of vitality or joy. His eyes held the peculiar combination of prurient curiosity and righteous disgust that marked those who had found a way to satisfy their fascination with forbidden pleasures while maintaining their moral superiority over those who actually experienced them. The sisters were assembled in the chapel to hear Brother Antonio explain his mission. His voice carried the nasal quality of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, and his words fell like blows on women who had already learned to fear any attention from male authority. He spoke of the need to purge Santa Chiara of any remaining attachment to worldly vanity, to examine every aspect of convent life for evidence that the sisters had not fully embraced the spiritual poverty that was their calling. He would be interviewing each nun individually, he announced, to assess her commitment to the reformed religious life that Florence now demanded. When Caterina's turn came for questioning, she found herself seated across from Brother Antonio in the same parlour where she had once met with her father to arrange her entry into religious life. The irony was bitter. Once again, a man was determining her fate while she sat in enforced silence, expected to submit to his judgment of her worthiness to exist within the narrow parameters he considered acceptable for women. Brother Antonio's questions began innocuously enough. Did she find the convent's discipline adequate for her spiritual development? Had she noticed any sisters who seemed insufficiently committed to their religious duties? Was she aware of any possessions or activities within Santa Chiara that might be considered inappropriate for women who'd renounced the world? But gradually his inquiries became more invasive, more clearly designed to elicit admissions of thought crimes rather than actual transgressions. Did she ever miss the luxuries of her former life? Did she sometimes look with longing at the fine clothes worn by visitors to the convent? Had she experienced dreams or fantasies that suggested her heart was not fully committed to her religious vocation? Did she understand that even thoughts of worldly pleasure were evidence of spiritual corruption that required confession and penance? Throughout the interrogation, Caterina maintained the perfect demeanour of humble religious submission. She kept her eyes downcast, spoke only when directly questioned, and gave answers that demonstrated appropriate shame for her human weaknesses, while expressing gratitude for the opportunity to purge herself of worldly attachment through religious discipline. She was, she assured Brother Antonio, deeply committed to embracing the poverty and purity that would prepare her soul for union with Christ. Any struggles she experienced with worldly temptation only made her more grateful for the strict discipline that would help her overcome her natural female weakness. But even as she performed this theatre of submission, Caterina was studying her interrogator with the intensity of a general analysing enemy fortifications. She noted how his breathing quickened when he asked about her dreams, how his hands trembled slightly when he inquired about her body's adjustment to the physical privations of religious life. She observed the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she was not looking, the barely concealed fascination with which he probed for details about her interior emotional life. Brother Antonio was not seeking evidence of genuine spiritual corruption. He was feeding on the psychological intimacy of forcing women to confess their most private thoughts and desires. The religious authority gave him license to probe into areas of female experience that would normally be forbidden to a celibate male, to explore the supposedly sinful inner lives of women while maintaining his own moral purity. The investigation was itself a form of violation, one that operated under the cover of spiritual guidance but served to satisfy the prurient curiosity of men who had found a way to experience forbidden intimacy without acknowledging their own complicity in the desires they claimed to condemn. This realization crystallized something in Caterina's understanding of the world she now inhabited. The system that claimed to protect her virtue was actually designed to make her psychologically and physically accessible to male authority in ways that would have been impossible in secular life. The convent walls that supposedly separated her from worldly temptation actually made her more vulnerable to a particular kind of masculine predation, one that operated under the guise of spiritual guidance and could never be challenged or exposed without the victim herself being condemned as spiritually corrupt. But recognition of the system's true nature also revealed its weaknesses. Men like Brother Antonio were dangerous precisely because they believed their own rhetoric about female weakness and male spiritual authority. They expected submission, compliance, and grateful acceptance of their right to probe and judge and punish. They did not expect to encounter a woman who understood their psychology better than they understood it themselves, who could use their assumptions and prejudices as weapons against them. As the interview concluded and Brother Antonio dismissed her with a benediction that felt more like a threat, Caterina began to formulate the strategy that would guide her survival in this place. She would give the authorities exactly what they expected: a woman broken by religious discipline, grateful for male guidance, ashamed of her natural human desires, desperate to please those who controlled her fate. She would perform submission so perfectly that they would never look too closely at what lay beneath the performance. And in the spaces created by their certainty of her powerlessness, she would build something they could never imagine, a realm where she controlled the terms of engagement, where she decided what to give and what to keep for herself, where the very completeness of her supposed subjugation would provide the perfect cover for a freedom more absolute than any she could have achieved in the outside world. The smoke was still rising from the Piazza della Signoria when the bells rang for Vespers that evening, calling the sisters to evening prayer. As Caterina knelt in the chapel and spoke the words of submission and devotion that were required of her, she was already planning the rebellion that would transform those same words into instruments of her liberation. Savonarola might rule Florence through fear and fire, but within the walls of Santa Chiara she intended to prove that intelligence and determination were more powerful than any amount of religious terror. The men who thought they had buried her alive in this place were about to discover that they had actually provided her with the perfect laboratory for exploring exactly how far a clever woman could push the boundaries of the possible. And by the time they realized their mistake, it would be far too late to stop what she had already set in motion. Chapter 3. Confessions of the Damned. The first crack in the fortress of Santa Chiara's surveillance came with the arrival of Father Lorenzo Benedetti on a November morning when frost painted the convent windows like delicate lace. He was 28 years old, which made him dangerously young for a confessor in a house full of women whose supposed sins required the guidance of mature spiritual authority. He was also beautiful in the way that Renaissance artists imagined angels, dark hair that caught light like polished bronze, eyes that held both intelligence and doubt, hands that moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to control his physical presence in spaces where it might be considered threatening. But what made Lorenzo truly dangerous was not his youth or his beauty, but the barely concealed crisis of faith that radiated from him like heat from a fever. He had been trained in the old tradition of Florentine Christianity, the humanistic approach that saw God's glory reflected in human learning and artistic achievement. Now he found himself serving in Savonarola's Florence, where beauty was sin and intellectual curiosity was evidence of prideful rebellion against divine authority. The contradiction was destroying him from within, and Caterina recognized his spiritual turmoil the moment he entered the confessional booth for their first encounter. The confessional itself was a masterpiece of medieval psychology, a wooden structure designed to facilitate intimate conversation while maintaining physical separation, to encourage emotional revelation while preserving the fiction of spiritual rather than human connection. The priest sat in darkness on one side, the penitent knelt in shadows on the other, and between them was only a carved screen that allowed voices to mingle while keeping bodies safely apart. It was meant to be a place where souls could be laid bare without the complications of physical attraction or personal attachment. But whoever designed confessionals had not anticipated someone like Caterina, who understood that psychological intimacy was often more powerful than physical contact, that the right words spoken in darkness could forge connections stronger than any amount of touching in daylight. She had been in Santa Chiara for 6 weeks when Father Lorenzo arrived. 6 weeks of observing and learning and preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity. She knew that her survival in this place would depend on her ability to create allies among the men who held power over her life, and a young priest struggling with his own doubts represented the perfect place to begin. Their first conversation established the pattern that would define everything that followed. Instead of confessing the trivial sins that nuns brought to the booth, moments of pride, flashes of anger, failures of charity toward their sisters, Caterina presented herself as a woman tormented by intellectual doubts about the very foundations of the faith she was supposed to embrace without question. She spoke of her struggle to reconcile the God of mercy described in the Gospels with the God of wrath proclaimed by Savonarola's sermons. She wondered aloud how a divine being who created beauty in nature could condemn human appreciation of beauty as sinful. She questioned whether the rigid poverty imposed on religious women truly reflected Christian virtue, or simply served the economic interests of those who profited from their unpaid labour. These were not the kinds of questions that Father Lorenzo expected to hear from enclosed nuns, and they struck at the heart of his own private struggles with Savonarolan theology. The official response would have been to counsel immediate submission to religious authority, to warn against the pride that led women to question teachings beyond their capacity to understand, to prescribe prayer and penance as remedies for dangerous intellectual curiosity. But Lorenzo found himself drawn into genuine theological discussion with this invisible woman whose voice carried an education that rivaled his own seminary training. Week after week, their conversations deepened and grew more intimate. Caterina revealed her knowledge of Platonic philosophy, her familiarity with the Church Fathers, her ability to engage with theological concepts that were supposed to be beyond female comprehension. She spoke of reading Augustine's Confessions and finding in his spiritual struggles a mirror for her own doubts about the compatibility of human nature with divine demands. She referenced Thomas Aquinas' arguments about natural law and wondered whether the suppression of all human desire truly served God's purposes or merely satisfied the control fantasies of earthly authorities. Lorenzo found himself looking forward to these sessions with an intensity that should have alarmed him. Here was an intellect that could match his own, a mind that grappled with the same questions that kept him awake at night, a voice that spoke the doubts he had never dared voice even to himself. The conversations took on a quality of mutual exploration that had nothing to do with the traditional relationship between confessor and penitent, and everything to do with two intelligent people finding in each other the intellectual companionship they had been denied by their respective forms of religious imprisonment. But Caterina was not content with mere intellectual connection. She understood that Father Lorenzo's attraction to their conversations was not purely spiritual, that his eagerness to engage with her ideas was complicated by his awareness of her as a woman as well as a mind. She began to introduce elements of personal revelation that blurred the boundaries between theological discussion and intimate confession. She spoke of her struggles with the physical deprivations of convent life, the way hunger and cold affected her ability to concentrate on prayer. She described the loneliness of sleeping in a narrow cell, the human need for warmth and comfort that religious discipline demanded she suppress, but could not entirely eliminate. These admissions created an atmosphere of shared vulnerability that transformed the confessional booth from a place of spiritual guidance into something more dangerous and more precious, a space where two people could be completely honest with each other about the gap between who they were required to be and who they actually were. Father Lorenzo began to reciprocate with his own confessions about the difficulty of maintaining celibacy while serving in a world that increasingly demanded the suppression of all human feeling, about his doubts regarding Savonarola's claims to divine inspiration, about his growing conviction that the current religious reforms were destroying rather than purifying the Church. The transformation from theological discussion to emotional intimacy took place gradually, over months of weekly encounters that neither of them acknowledged as anything other than the proper spiritual guidance of a confessor helping a troubled penitent. But by the time spring arrived and the convent gardens began to bloom with new life, both Caterina and Lorenzo understood that something had developed between them that had nothing to do with religious duty and everything to do with the human hunger for understanding and connection. The crisis came on a night in early April, when a thunderstorm lashed the convent with unusual violence. The sisters had been called to special prayers to ask God's protection from the lightning that split the sky and this wind that rattled every window in the ancient building. As they knelt in the chapel, the storm seemed to echo the spiritual turmoil that Savonarola's reforms had brought to Florence, all fury and destruction with little promise of the peace that was supposed to follow divine judgment. Father Lorenzo had remained in the confessional after the evening session, ostensibly to pray for guidance in his spiritual duties, but actually to struggle with his growing awareness that his feelings for the woman he knew only as a voice in darkness had moved far beyond appropriate pastoral concern. When Caterina appeared at the confessional booth during the height of the storm, seeking what she claimed was emergency spiritual counsel for doubts that tormented her sleep, they both understood that they had reached the moment when pretense would no longer be possible. Their conversation that night dispensed with the elaborate theological frameworks they had used to disguise their growing intimacy. Instead, they spoke directly about the impossible situation they had created. Two people drawn to each other by genuine intellectual and emotional compatibility, trapped by religious vows and social circumstances that made any authentic relationship between them not just forbidden, but potentially deadly. The storm outside provided cover for their voices, and the darkness of the confessional booth seemed to offer a privacy that existed nowhere else in their supervised lives. When Caterina pressed her lips against the carved screen that separated them, neither of them pretended that it was anything other than what it was, a kiss between a man and a woman who had found in each other something they had been seeking without knowing it existed. The wood was cold against their skin, but the contact was electric with the intensity of long-delayed physical expression of feelings they had been nurturing in secret for months. It lasted only seconds, but it transformed everything between them from theoretical transgression to actual sin, from emotional intimacy to physical desire that would demand satisfaction regardless of the consequences. But even as she kissed him through the confessional screen, Caterina was calculating the implications of what she had initiated. Father Lorenzo represented her first successful penetration of the male power structure that controlled every aspect of life in Santa Chiara. His growing attachment to her created possibilities she had been planning for since her arrival, opportunities to gain information about convent politics, protection from the worst aspects of religious discipline, and perhaps most importantly, access to the world beyond the convent walls through someone who moved freely between religious and secular society. Lorenzo, for his part, experienced the kiss as both salvation and damnation. Here was proof that human connection was possible even within the most restrictive circumstances, that the capacity for love and desire could survive even systematic attempts to crush it out of existence. But it was also evidence of his complete failure as a priest, his inability to maintain the boundaries that were supposed to define his relationship with those under his spiritual guidance, his susceptibility to exactly the kind of temptation that Savonarolan doctrine insisted was the inevitable result of allowing human nature any freedom from divine control. In the days that followed, both of them tried to pretend that nothing had changed. Father Lorenzo continued to provide spiritual guidance to the sisters of Santa Chiara with the same apparent dedication to his duties. Caterina maintained her performance of penitent submission to religious authority. but their weekly confessional sessions now carried an undercurrent of sexual tension that made every theological discussion feel like foreplay, every moment of shared intellectual excitement like a form of seduction. The real danger was not that they would be discovered in some moment of obvious physical transgression, but that their emotional intimacy would become visible to the surveillance network that monitored every relationship within the convent. Mother Superior Suor Margherita had developed a particular talent for detecting the subtle signs of inappropriate attachment between nuns and the various men who served Santa Chiara in official capacities. A glance held too long, a conversation that continued beyond its stated purpose, a change in demeanour that suggested someone had found a source of happiness outside the approved channels of religious devotion. All of these could trigger investigations that would destroy everyone involved. But Caterina had advantages that other women in similar situations lacked. Her careful study of convent politics had taught her exactly how to manage the appearance of proper religious behaviour while pursuing her actual goals. She understood that the key to avoiding detection was not to eliminate all signs of change in her behaviour, but to ensure that any changes could be attributed to deepening religious devotion rather than worldly attachment. She began to request additional time for private prayer, to speak more frequently about her gratitude for Father Lorenzo's spiritual guidance, to demonstrate exactly the kind of growing piety that the authorities wanted to see in the nuns under their care. This performance served multiple purposes. It provided cover for the time she spent thinking about Lorenzo and planning their future encounters. It established her reputation as a nun making exceptional spiritual progress, which would protect her from the kind of scrutiny that fell on sisters who seemed insufficiently committed to religious life. Most importantly, it created legitimate reasons for her to seek additional private conferences with her confessor, opportunities that could be used for purposes that had nothing to do with spiritual guidance. By summer, Father Lorenzo had become Caterina's first successful conquest in her campaign to build a network of male allies who could provide protection and resources for the larger rebellion she was planning. He believed that their relationship represented a spiritual and emotional connection that transcended the artificial boundaries imposed by religious law. She understood it as the successful weaponization of intellectual seduction, the proof that even men trained to resist feminine influence could be manipulated through careful appeals to their psychological and emotional needs. But the relationship also represented something more complex and dangerous than simple strategic manipulation. In Father Lorenzo, Caterina had found genuine intellectual companionship of a kind that would have been impossible in secular life, where women were excluded from the universities and scholarly discussions that shaped Renaissance thought. Their conversations about theology and philosophy were not merely cover for physical attraction. They were authentic exchanges between equals that fed a hunger for learning and understanding that religious life was supposed to suppress, but had actually intensified. This created a peculiar situation where Caterina's most calculated seduction was also her most genuine relationship, where her most strategic manipulation was also her most honest human connection. Father Lorenzo was both her victim and her partner, both the tool she was using to penetrate the male power structure and the person who understood her better than anyone else in her new world. As autumn returned to Florence, and the first anniversary of her transformation into Sister Caterina approached, she understood that she had successfully completed the first phase of her rebellion. She had identified the weaknesses in the system designed to control her, had established her first alliance with male authority, and had begun the process of creating spaces within the convent where she could exist as something other than the submissive religious woman she was required to be. But she also understood that Father Lorenzo was only the beginning. One ally would not be sufficient for the kind of freedom she intended to claim within these walls. She would need to expand her network, to cultivate relationships with different kinds of men who could provide different kinds of resources and protection. The skills she had developed in seducing a troubled young priest would serve her well in approaching the merchants, aristocrats, and artisans whose business brought them into contact with Santa Chiara. The confessional booth would always hold special significance as the place where she had first learned to transform male desire into female power, where she had discovered that even the most restrictive circumstances could be turned to her advantage by someone willing to study their weaknesses and exploit them without mercy. But it was only the first classroom in an education that would ultimately encompass every form of masculine authority that Florence had to offer. Father Lorenzo had no way of knowing that the kiss they shared through the carved screen was not the beginning of a love affair, but the first successful experiment in a campaign that would eventually involve some of the most powerful men in the city. He saw their relationship as a personal connection that existed despite the impossible circumstances that surrounded them. Caterina understood it as proof that no system of control was so complete that it could not be subverted by someone with sufficient intelligence, patience, and ruthless determination to claim whatever freedom was possible within the constraints of an unfree world. Chapter 4. Blueprints of Rebellion. Winter arrived early that year, seeping into the ancient stones of Santa Chiara like a living thing that fed on warmth and hope. By December, frost covered the narrow windows of Caterina's cell each morning, and the thin blanket provided for her narrow bed offered no protection against the cold that rose from the stone floors like the breath of the dead. It was during one of these bitter nights, when sleep proved impossible despite her exhaustion from the day's endless cycle of prayer and labour, that she decided to explore the convent's forgotten spaces in earnest. She had been cataloguing architectural anomalies since her arrival, places where the walls seemed thicker than necessary, corridors that ended abruptly without apparent purpose, chambers whose proportions suggested they were smaller than the external dimension should have allowed. These inconsistencies spoke of a building that had been constructed and reconstructed over centuries, with each generation adding to and modifying the work of their predecessors, without necessarily preserving complete records of what lay beneath their improvements. Santa Chiara had been founded in the 13th century as part of the great expansion of Franciscan houses throughout Tuscany, but the current structure incorporated elements from at least 4 different building campaigns. The original medieval foundation had been expanded in the 14th century, when the convent's population grew beyond its initial capacity. The 15th century had brought Renaissance improvements designed to create more gracious living spaces for the noble daughters who comprised most of the community. Most recently, Savonarola's reforms had mandated modifications intended to eliminate any traces of luxury or comfort that might distract the sisters from their spiritual duties. But what fascinated Caterina was not the documented history of construction, but the evidence of spaces that had been deliberately concealed during various renovation projects. Medieval builders, she knew from her reading in her father's library, often incorporated hidden passages and concealed chambers into religious and residential buildings as protection against siege, civil unrest, or religious persecution. These spaces were designed to be invisible to casual observation, but accessible to those who possessed detailed knowledge of their location and entrance mechanisms. The clue that would unlock Santa Chiara's secrets came from an unexpected source. While cleaning the Mother Superior's private chambers, a duty assigned to her as punishment for some minor infraction that Suor Margherita had detected or imagined, Caterina discovered a collection of architectural drawings stored in a wooden chest that had clearly been untouched for decades. The parchments were yellowed with age and brittle from neglect, but the careful ink lines and precise measurements were still clearly legible to someone who knew how to read them. The drawings bore the signature and seal of Marco Strozzi, master builder, her own father, before financial ruin had reduced him to the desperate expedient of selling his daughter to secure his family's survival. The irony struck her with physical force. The same man who had delivered her into this prison had also, decades earlier, participated in creating the very mechanisms that could provide her escape from its most oppressive restrictions. According to the drawings, the renovations her father had supervised in the 1470s had not simply added new chambers and corridors to the existing structure. They had also preserved and expanded a network of concealed passages that connected various parts of the building through spaces that existed between the official architecture. These passages had been designed originally as escape routes during the frequent civil wars that plagued medieval Florence, but the plans showed how they could also serve as hidden transportation corridors within the building itself. More intriguingly, the drawings revealed that several of the concealed passages led to chambers that were completely separate from the convent's documented spaces, rooms that existed in the gaps between official areas, accessible only through hidden entrances, invisible to anyone who was not aware of their existence. These chambers had been stocked with supplies and furnished for extended occupation during emergencies, but the renovations of the 1470s had updated them with amenities that suggested they could serve residential as well as defensive purposes. The discovery of these plans transformed Caterina's understanding of her situation. Instead of being trapped within a building designed for surveillance and control, she was actually living in a structure that contained multiple layers of hidden space, secret passages that could provide freedom of movement without detection, concealed chambers that could serve as private domains beyond the reach of religious authority. The convent that appeared to offer no privacy or autonomy actually contained spaces where she could exist entirely on her own terms if she possessed the knowledge and courage to claim them. But knowledge was not the same as access, and the architectural drawings raised as many questions as they answered. The passages and chambers they depicted had been sealed during subsequent renovations, their entrances concealed behind new construction that made them invisible to current inhabitants. Finding these spaces would require not just understanding their theoretical location, but discovering the physical mechanisms that controlled access to them. The search began in the most logical place, her own cell, which according to the drawings was located adjacent to one of the major passage networks. The walls appeared to be solid stone covered with a thin layer of plaster, but careful examination revealed subtle variations in texture and colour that suggested some sections were newer than others. More importantly, gentle pressure applied at specific points produced hollow sounds that indicated empty space behind apparently solid surfaces. The breakthrough came during the Feast of the Epiphany, when the entire community was occupied with special liturgical observances that would keep them in chapel for hours at a time. Working with a nail file she had managed to conceal during one of the monthly inspections of personal possessions, Caterina carefully scraped away plaster from an area where the architectural drawing suggested there should be an entrance mechanism. What she discovered was a section of wall composed not of solid stone but of carefully fitted blocks that could be moved if manipulated in the correct sequence. The entrance mechanism was a masterpiece of medieval engineering designed to be invisible to casual observation but accessible to someone who understood its operation. A series of stone blocks that appeared to be permanently mortared in place could actually be shifted by applying pressure in a specific pattern, creating an opening just large enough for a person to pass through. Once inside, the blocks could be repositioned from the interior, leaving no trace that the wall had ever been disturbed. Beyond the concealed entrance lay a narrow passage that extended into darkness beyond the reach of candlelight. The air was stale but not fetid, suggesting that the space was sealed but not completely cut off from ventilation. Following the passage with careful steps, Caterina discovered that it led to a chamber approximately 12 feet square, with a vaulted ceiling high enough for comfortable standing and stone walls that showed evidence of having been plastered and painted in some distant past. But what made the chamber extraordinary was not its size or construction, but what it contained. The renovation supervised by her father had left it furnished with items that spoke of long-term habitation rather than mere emergency shelter. There was a wooden bed frame with rope supports that could hold a mattress, a table and chairs of simple but sturdy construction, shelves built into the walls that could accommodate books and personal possessions, and most remarkably, a small fireplace with a chimney that must connect to one of the main flues in ways that would make smoke invisible from outside the building. More intriguing still were the personal items that had been left behind by whoever had last occupied the space. A collection of books that included not just religious texts, but works of classical literature and contemporary philosophy that would have been considered inappropriate for women. Clothing that suggested both male and female occupants had used the chamber at different times. Most tellingly, a collection of love letters written in multiple hands, evidence that this hidden space had served as a meeting place for relationships that could not be conducted in the public areas of the convent. The implications were staggering. She was not the first woman in Santa Chiara's history to discover the existence of these concealed spaces, and she was certainly not the first to recognize their potential for creating a private life beyond the supervision of a religious authority. The chamber she had found was part of a tradition of hidden rebellion that stretched back generations, a secret history of women who had refused to accept the complete suppression of their autonomy and desire even within the most restrictive religious environment. But the chamber also revealed the dangers inherent in claiming such freedom. The dust and abandonment that characterized the space suggested that its previous occupants had ultimately been discovered, their rebellion exposed and punished in ways that had left the hidden rooms empty for years or even decades. The love letters scattered on the floor spoke of relationships that had ended in separation, exile, or worse. The books left behind suggested people who had been forced to abandon their intellectual pursuits along with their physical freedom. This discovery deepened Caterina's understanding of what she was attempting and what it would cost if she failed. The hidden chambers were not simply convenient spaces for secret meetings. They were archaeological evidence of an ongoing war between institutional control and individual freedom, a war in which the casualties were measured not just in careers and reputations, but in lives destroyed and stories erased from official memory. The women who had used this chamber before her had been pioneers in the same rebellion she was now planning, and their ultimate defeat served as both inspiration and warning for what lay ahead. But if the Chamber's history revealed the dangers of hidden rebellion, it also demonstrated its possibilities. The very existence of this space proved that even the most complete system of surveillance and control contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge and determination. The careful engineering of the concealed entrance showed that medieval builders had anticipated the need for spaces beyond official authority and had created mechanisms for maintaining them across centuries. Most importantly, the evidence of previous occupation demonstrated that it was actually possible to live a double life within these walls, to maintain the appearance of the religious submission while claiming substantial areas of genuine freedom. Over the following weeks, Caterina began the careful process of making the chamber habitable, while ensuring that her activities remained undetected by the surveillance network that monitored every aspect of convent life. She smuggled blankets and personal items from her official cell, a few pieces at a time, and only during periods when she could be certain of privacy. She cleaned and organized the space, removing evidence of previous occupation while preserving anything that might prove useful for her own purposes. Most importantly, she began to map the full extent of the passage network, discovering connections to other parts of the building that would allow her to move freely through Santa Chiara without using any of the monitored corridors or chambers. The hidden chamber became more than just a retreat from the oppressive atmosphere of official convent life. It became the foundation for an alternative existence that operated according to her own rules rather than those imposed by religious authority. Here she could think without the constant pressure of surveillance, plan without fibus or fear of discovery, and gradually begin to construct the network of relationships and resources that would support the larger rebellion she envisioned. But even as she claimed this space as her own, Caterina remained acutely aware that her success depended on maintaining the perfect performance of religious submission in all her public appearances. The hidden chamber was valuable precisely because it was hidden, and any change in her behavior that suggested she had found sources of satisfaction outside approved religious channels would trigger the kind of investigation that could destroy everything she had built. The winter nights were no longer cold and sleepless. Instead, they became opportunities to exist fully as herself, rather than as the compliant religious woman she pretended to be during daylight hours. In the hidden chamber, surrounded by the evidence of previous rebellions and warmed by carefully managed fires that left no trace of smoke, she began to plan the expansion of her secret kingdom and the recruitment of the allies who would help her transform Santa Chiara from a prison into the setting for the most elaborate deception in Florentine history. The architectural drawings that had revealed the chamber's existence remained hidden in Mother Superior's chest, but Caterina had memorized every line and measurement. She understood now that her father's signature on those plans was not just evidence of his involvement in the convent's construction, but his inadvertent gift to the daughter, whose freedom he had been forced to sacrifice for the family's survival. The same economic desperation that had delivered her into religious imprisonment had also provided her with the tools needed to transform that imprisonment into a different kind of liberation entirely. By spring, the hidden chamber would become the nerve center of operations that would involve some of the most powerful men in Florence and create scandal that would be whispered about for generations. But for now, it was simply a cold stone room where a young woman sat by candlelight, planning her rebellion against a system that had tried to reduce her to nothing more than a vessel for approved religious sentiment. The stones that surrounded her had kept the secrets of previous rebels. Now they would keep hers as well, until the day came when secrecy was no longer necessary or possible. Chapter 5. The Merchant of Flesh and Words. Spring brought more than warmth to Santa Chiara. It brought opportunity in the form of increased commercial activity as the convent scriptorium prepared for the year's most lucrative commissions. The copying and illumination of manuscripts provided one of the few sources of income that religious houses could pursue without violating the principle of apostolic poverty, and Santa Chiara had developed a reputation for producing work of exceptional quality. Noble families throughout Tuscany commissioned prayer books, wealthy merchants ordered copies of classical texts, and even foreign dignitaries sought out the convent's scribes for projects that required both artistic skill and absolute discretion. This commerce created one of the few opportunities for enclosed nuns to interact with men from the secular world, though such interactions were heavily regulated and closely monitored. The arrangements were always conducted through intermediaries, the negotiations handled by Bemendo male clergy acting on the convent's behalf, and the actual transfer of materials managed through carefully controlled procedures that minimized direct contact between the sisters and their clients. But the work itself required detailed consultations about artistic specifications, textual accuracy, and delivery schedules that sometimes necessitated more extensive communication than the standard protocols allowed. It was through this narrow opening in the convent's otherwise impermeable barriers that Giuliano Vespucci entered Caterina's world on a morning in late March, when the first flowers were beginning to bloom in the convent's carefully tended gardens. He came seeking a very specific commission, a complete copy of Plato's Republic with illuminated marginalia that would incorporate both classical and Christian symbolism in ways that demonstrated the compatibility between ancient wisdom and contemporary faith. The project was complex enough to require direct consultation with the scribes who would execute it, expensive enough to override normal restrictions on secular contact, and politically sensitive enough to demand the kind of discretion that Santa Chiara was famous for providing. Giuliano was 26 years old, the third son of a family whose maritime trading empire had made the Vespucci name synonymous with exploration and commercial innovation. His cousin Amerigo had recently returned from voyages that were revolutionizing European understanding of world geography, but Giuliano's interests lay in more traditional forms of discovery, the recovery and preservation of classical texts that had been lost or corrupted during the medieval period. He possessed the humanist education that characterized Renaissance merchant families, the financial resources that such education required, and the intellectual curiosity that made dangerous knowledge irresistibly attractive. But what made Giuliano truly dangerous to the ordered world of Santa Chiara was not his wealth or his education, but his genuine respect for female intelligence combined with his complete ignorance of how that respect could be weaponized against him. He'd grown up in a household where his mother and sisters were expected to be conversant with literature and philosophy, where women's intellectual contributions were valued even if their social roles remained constrained by conventional expectations. When he found himself in consultation with Sister Caterina about the Platonic manuscript, he treated her as he would have treated any learned person whose expertise he required, as an intellectual equal deserving of serious attention and respectful engagement. This attitude was so unprecedented in Caterina's experience of male authority that it initially left her uncertain how to respond. The men she had encountered in religious contexts, priests, confessors, visiting officials, all operated from assumptions of masculine intellectual superiority that made their condescension predictable and therefore manipulable. Father Lorenzo's attraction to her mind was complicated by his guilt about transgressing proper clerical behavior, making him vulnerable to emotional manipulation. But Giuliano simply assumed that a woman capable of executing complex manuscript illumination must possess sophisticated understanding of the texts involved, and he engaged with her ideas as if gender was irrelevant to intellectual capacity. Their first meeting took place in the convent's parlour under the watchful eye of Mother Superior Suor Margherita, who remained present throughout the consultation to ensure that no inappropriate intimacy developed between the client and the religious woman contracted to serve his needs. The conversation focused entirely on technical matters, the specific editions of Plato that would provide the most accurate textual foundation, the iconographic traditions that should inform the illuminated elements, the materials and techniques that would ensure the manuscript's durability over time. But beneath the surface of professional discussion, something more complex was developing. Caterina found herself genuinely engaged by Giuliano's questions about Platonic philosophy, his interest in the ways that classical ideas about justice and virtue could be reconciled with Christian teachings about salvation and divine love. Here was someone who shared her hunger for intellectual exploration, who understood that ideas had practical implications for how human beings should organize their lives and societies. Most remarkably, he seemed to assume that she possessed not just technical skills in manuscript production, but substantive knowledge about the philosophical content she was being asked to illustrate. For his part, Giuliano was fascinated by the depth of understanding that Sister Caterina brought to their discussions. He had expected to find competent artisans capable of following detailed instructions about visual elements. Instead, he discovered someone who could engage with the theoretical implications of Plato's political philosophy, who understood the theological controversies surrounding the relationship between reason and revelation, who possessed insights about textual interpretation that enhanced rather than merely implemented his vision for the project. The formal consultation concluded with arrangements for Giuliano to return the following week with more detailed specifications for the illuminated elements, but both participants understood that the intellectual connection they had discovered demanded further exploration. For Caterina, Giuliano represented something she had been seeking since her arrival at Santa Chiara: access to the world of Renaissance humanism that was transforming European culture but remained largely closed to women, especially women in religious life. For Giuliano, she represented the possibility of intellectual collaboration with someone whose perspective had been shaped by circumstances completely different from his own, but whose mental capacity clearly equalled or exceeded that of his university-educated male contemporaries. The second meeting took place under less formal circumstances. Giuliano requested permission to examine some of the convent's existing manuscript collection to better understand the house style that his commission should reflect, and Suor Margherita assigned Caterina to provide him with access to the materials he needed. This arrangement created opportunities for extended conversation that, while technically focused on professional matters, actually ranged across the full spectrum of contemporary intellectual concerns. They discussed the implications of recent geographical discoveries for classical theories about the inhabited world. They debated the relationship between individual virtue and political justice in ways that touched on current controversies about republican government versus princely rule. They explored the theological problems created by humanist emphasis on human dignity and potential in a religious context that stressed human sinfulness and dependence on divine grace. These conversations revealed the breadth of Caterina's self-education and the sophistication of Giuliano's thinking in ways that created mutual intellectual respect and admiration. But Caterina was not content with mere intellectual companionship, however genuinely satisfying she found it. Her survival in Santa Chiara depended on building a network of male allies who could provide protection and resources for the larger rebellion she was planning, and Giuliano's position in Florentine commercial society made him potentially valuable for purposes that went far beyond manuscript commissioning. She began to introduce more personal elements into their conversations, sharing carefully selected details about the challenges of intellectual life within the constraints of religious enclosure, the frustration of possessing capabilities that had no legitimate outlet in her current circumstances. These revelations created an atmosphere of shared vulnerability that transformed their relationship from professional collaboration to something approaching personal friendship. Giuliano found himself moved by the waste of intellectual potential that Caterina's situation represented, by the injustice of a system that buried genuine talent beneath layers of institutional oppression. He began to speak about his own struggles with family expectations that prioritized commercial success over scholarly pursuits, his sense of being trapped between his intellectual interests and his practical obligations to the Vespucci trading empire. The transformation from friendship to something more dangerous occurred gradually, over weeks of conversations that grew increasingly intimate despite the formal restrictions that governed their interaction. Caterina began to suggest that their intellectual connection represented something fierce and rare, a meeting of minds that transcended the artificial boundaries imposed by religious and social conventions. She spoke of the loneliness of possessing thoughts and feelings that could not be shared with anyone in her daily environment, the hunger for understanding that gnawed at her like physical starvation. Giuliano responded to these hints with growing recognition that his own emotional and intellectual needs were being satisfied by their conversations in ways that his relationships with socially appropriate women never achieved. The noble daughters available to him as potential marriage partners had been educated to be decorative rather than substantive, capable of managing households and producing heirs, but not of engaging with the ideas that most interested him. Sister Caterina offered intellectual partnership of a kind that seemed impossible to find elsewhere, complicated by the additional intensity that came from its forbidden nature. By the time summer arrived and work on the Platonic manuscript was well advanced, both participants understood that their relationship had moved far beyond its original professional framework. Giuliano began to extend his visits beyond what the work actually required, inventing new questions and complications that justified additional consultations. Caterina started requesting private time to pray for divine guidance regarding the project's theological implications, using these periods to think about Giuliano and plan strategies for deepening his emotional investment in their relationship. The crisis came when Giuliano completed his examination of the convent's existing manuscript collection and could no longer justify regular visits to Santa Chiara without arousing suspicion about his true motives. The Platonic commission was nearly finished, and soon he would have no legitimate reason to maintain contact with the woman who had become the most intellectually and emotionally satisfying relationship of his adult life. The prospect of losing this connection forced both of them to acknowledge that what had developed between them could no longer be contained within the boundaries of appropriate religious and commercial interaction. It was Caterina who suggested the solution that would transform their relationship from intellectual friendship to active conspiracy against religious authority. During what was supposed to be their final consultation, she mentioned her discovery of certain architectural anomalies within the convent that suggested the existence of spaces not included in the building's official floor plan. She spoke of her curiosity about these spaces, her desire to explore them more thoroughly, and her need for assistance that could only come from someone with access to architectural knowledge and construction materials from outside the convent. Giuliano understood immediately that she was inviting him to participate in something that went far beyond manuscript illumination, something that would require ongoing secret contact and mutual trust of a kind that could not be justified by any legitimate purpose. The proposal appealed to every aspect of his personality: his intellectual curiosity about architectural mysteries, his romantic attraction to forbidden adventure, his genuine concern for Caterina's welfare, and his growing need to maintain the relationship they had built regardless of social or religious obstacles. His agreement to help her explore Santa Chiara's hidden spaces marked the transformation of Giuliano from client to collaborator, from admirer to accomplice, from potential ally to actual asset in the network of support she was building for her rebellion against religious authority. But it also marked her successful transition, from strategic thinking to active implementation, from planning rebellion to actually executing it through the manipulation of male desire disguised as intellectual partnership. The hidden chamber that her father's architectural drawings had revealed became the setting for their first truly private meeting, away from the surveillance that monitored every other space in the convent. Giuliano's entrance into that concealed room through passages that officially did not exist represented more than just physical transgression of religious boundaries. It was the creation of an alternative world where different rules applied, where a supposedly enclosed nun and a secular merchant could meet as intellectual and emotional equals, without reference to the social conventions that otherwise governed their lives. But even as they explored the chamber together, examining its construction and marvelling at the ingenuity of its concealment, Caterina remained acutely aware that she was conducting an experiment in the management of male psychology rather than pursuing a genuine romantic relationship. Giuliano's attraction to her mind was real, his respect for her intelligence was authentic, and his concern for her welfare was sincere. But from her perspective, these feelings were resources to be cultivated and exploited rather than reciprocated, tools for building the network of male support that would enable her to create a life of genuine freedom within the constraints of religious imprisonment. The manuscripts he brought to their secret meetings, philosophical texts, classical literature, contemporary works that were forbidden to religious women, became symbols of the intellectual liberation she was claiming for herself through careful manipulation of his desires. The gifts he offered, fine paper, expensive inks, small luxuries that made the hidden chamber more comfortable, represented the material benefits that could be extracted from masculine need for feminine appreciation and companionship. Most importantly, Giuliano's position in Florentine commercial society provided her with information about political developments, economic opportunities, and social relationships that could prove useful as she expanded her network of male allies. Through him, she gained insight into which merchants might be susceptible to similar intellectual seduction, which aristocrats were struggling with financial problems that made them vulnerable to feminine influence, which artisans possessed skills that could be useful for expanding and improving the hidden spaces within Santa Chiara. By autumn, what had begun as a commission for manuscript illumination had become the foundation for systematic subversion of religious authority through the weaponization of Renaissance humanism. Giuliano believed he was participating in a love affair that transcended social boundaries through the power of genuine intellectual and emotional connection. Caterina understood that she had successfully recruited her first secular ally in a campaign that would eventually involve men from every level of Florentine society. The Platonic manuscript was completed that October, its illuminated margins depicting the harmony between classical wisdom and Christian truth in visual metaphors of extraordinary complexity and beauty. But the real masterpiece was not the decorated text that Giuliano would display in his library. It was the network of deception and manipulation that Caterina was constructing within the walls of Santa Chiara, using male hunger for intellectual and emotional connection as the foundation for female rebellion against the very system of masculine authority that made such hunger necessary in the first place. Chapter 6. The Patron's Privilege. The arrival of Count Filippo Orsini at Santa Chiara in November coincided with the first heavy frost of winter, as if his presence carried its own chill into spaces that were already cold enough to numb both body and spirit. He came not as a supplicant seeking spiritual services, but as a man surveying property he considered his own, by virtue of the substantial donations that kept the convent operational when other sources of income proved insufficient. The Orsini family had been patrons of Santa Chiara for 3 generations, contributing enough wealth over the decades to fund major construction projects, maintain the building's fabric against the ravages of time and weather, and ensure that the sisters could focus on their spiritual duties without the distraction of financial anxiety. But patronage, as Caterina quickly learned, was never a simple matter of charitable donation, without expectation of return. The families who supported religious institutions expected recognition of their generosity, accommodation of their preferences, and access to the communities they funded in ways that reflected their social status and confirmed their importance. For the Orsini, this meant treating Santa Chiara as an extension of their own household, a place where they could exercise authority over women who had no choice but to receive their attention with gratitude and submission. Count Filippo was 43 years old, possessed of the kind of commanding physical presence that came from a lifetime of expecting immediate obedience from everyone around him. He had inherited wealth, political influence, and social position that made him one of the most powerful men in Florence. But he had also inherited the particular form of masculine entitlement that considered all women, regardless of their religious vows or social status, as existing primarily for male pleasure and convenience. His marriage to a woman from an equally noble family had produced the required heirs and secured important political alliances, but it had not satisfied his appetite for conquest and domination that required constant feeding with new sources of feminine submission. Religious women presented a particular attraction, for men like Count Filippo, because they offered the thrill of corrupting supposed virtue while remaining completely vulnerable to masculine authority. Unlike secular women who might have families to protect them or social connections to complain about inappropriate behaviour, nuns were legally dead to the world and had no recourse against patrons whose generosity made their survival possible. The very completeness of their supposed separation from worldly concerns made them paradoxically more accessible to worldly predation, since any complaints they might make about improper treatment could be dismissed as evidence of insufficient religious detachment or inappropriate focus on temporal rather than spiritual matters. Count Filippo's method of establishing contact with Sister Caterina demonstrated both his sophistication and his arrogance. Rather than requesting meetings for obviously secular purposes that might arouse suspicion or resistance, he arranged for a series of spiritual consultations designed to explore his own religious development and need for guidance in living a more devout Christian life. The fiction was transparent. Everyone involved understood that his sudden interest in religious counsel had nothing to do with genuine spiritual crisis, but it provided the necessary cover for private meetings that would otherwise have been impossible to justify. Mother Superior Suor Margherita was entirely complicit in facilitating these arrangements, not because she was unaware of Count Filippo's true motives, but because she understood that the convent's financial survival depended on maintaining the goodwill of its most important patrons. The donations from noble families like the Orsini represented the difference between basic subsistence and genuine comfort for the religious community and challenging a patron's requests, no matter how inappropriate they might be, could result in the withdrawal of support that would devastate the institution's ability to function. The first consultation took place in the convent's formal parlour, with Suor Margherita present throughout the meeting to ensure that proper decorum was maintained. Count Filippo presented himself as a man troubled by the gap between his worldly responsibilities and his desire for spiritual perfection, seeking guidance from someone whose complete dedication to religious life could help him navigate the challenges of living virtuously while managing secular affairs. The questions he posed were sophisticated enough to require genuine theological knowledge to answer, but they were also designed to elicit personal information about Caterina's own spiritual development and emotional state. Caterina recognized immediately what was happening. and understood that she was facing a situation far more dangerous than her previous encounters with male authority within Santa Chiara. Father Lorenzo represented emotional and intellectual need that could be satisfied through carefully managed intimacy. Giuliano offered mutual respect and genuine collaboration that served both participants' interests, but Count Filippo embodied raw power exercised without concern for reciprocity or consent, the kind of masculine dominance that took what it wanted regardless of the cost to its objects. But she also recognized that his very dangerousness made him potentially valuable in ways that her other relationships could not provide. Count Filippo's position in Florentine society gave him access to political information and social connections that could be crucial for protecting her growing network of secret relationships. His wealth could provide resources that would be impossible to obtain through other channels. Most importantly, his patronage of Santa Chiara meant that his protection could shield her from investigations or punishments that might otherwise destroy everything she was building. The challenge was managing a man whose power made him accustomed to immediate satisfaction of his desires, who possessed the social authority to destroy her if she refused his advances, but who could also destroy her if she submitted too easily and lost his interest. Count Filippo was not seeking mere physical conquest that he could obtain from any number of women whose circumstances made resistance impossible. What he wanted from Sister Caterina was the specific thrill of corrupting religious virtue, the psychological satisfaction of making a bride of Christ betray her vows for his pleasure. This meant that her survival depended on maintaining a careful balance between resistance and submission, providing enough encouragement to keep his interest engaged, while offering sufficient moral conflict to preserve the sense of transgression that made the pursuit exciting for him. She had to appear to struggle against his influence while gradually succumbing to it, to maintain the fiction of religious innocence while demonstrating enough sophistication to make the corruption process genuinely satisfying. Their second meeting established the pattern that would define their relationship for months to come. Count Filippo requested private spiritual counsel regarding specific moral dilemmas he claimed to face in his secular responsibilities, and Suor Margherita arranged for Sister Caterina to provide this guidance in a smaller chamber where their conversation could be more intimate while still maintaining appropriate religious context. The questions he posed required her to discuss abstract theological principles in ways that inevitably led to more personal territory: the nature of temptation, the struggle between spiritual ideals and human weakness, the process by which good people could be led into sin through circumstances beyond their control. These discussions allowed Count Filippo to probe for information about her own vulnerabilities while presenting his interest as pastoral concern rather than predatory investigation. He spoke about the loneliness that came with high social position, the difficulty of finding genuine understanding among people whose responses were always shaped by awareness of his power and wealth. He described the burden of maintaining public virtue while struggling with private doubts and desires that could not be acknowledged without damaging his reputation and influence. Caterina responded to these revelations with exactly the combination of sympathy and moral concern that he was seeking. She expressed genuine distress at his spiritual suffering, while acknowledging her own limited understanding of the challenges faced by those who bore worldly responsibilities. She offered prayers for his welfare and suggested spiritual exercises that might help him find peace in his relationship with divine authority. But she also began to introduce subtle suggestions that his struggles might be eased through friendship with someone who could provide understanding without judgment, companionship without ulterior motives. The transformation from spiritual consultation to personal relationship occurred gradually, through a series of meetings that grew longer and more intimate as Count Filippo's supposed need for religious guidance expanded to encompass every aspect of his emotional and psychological life. He began to speak about his dissatisfaction with relationships that were shaped by social expectations rather than genuine compatibility, his hunger for intellectual stimulation that his current social circle could not provide, his desire for feminine companionship that was motivated by appreciation for his personal qualities rather than mere recognition of his status and wealth. Caterina encouraged these confidences while maintaining the appropriate degree of religious detachment, expressing concern for his welfare while emphasizing her own limitations as someone whose life experiences had been confined to religious contexts. But she also began to reveal carefully selected aspects of her own personality that would appeal to his particular psychological needs: her intelligence, her appreciation for learning and culture, her capacity for understanding complex emotional, situations despite her supposed innocence of worldly affairs. The critical moment came during their 5th private consultation, when Count Filippo abandoned the pretense of seeking spiritual guidance and spoke directly about his growing attraction to her as a woman, rather than merely a religious counsellor. He described the fascination she held for him as someone who combined intellectual sophistication with moral purity, worldly understanding with spiritual dedication. He spoke about the rarity of finding genuine compatibility with someone whose response to him was not shaped by calculation about social or financial advantage, but he also made clear that his interest carried expectations that went far beyond appropriate relationships between patron and religious woman. He spoke about his desire to provide special assistance for her spiritual development, his willingness to ensure that her life at Santa Chiara was as comfortable and fulfilling as possible, his ability to protect her from the harsher aspects of religious discipline that affected sisters who lacked powerful advocates. The implications were unmistakable. His patronage could make her life significantly easier, but it would come at the cost of providing him with the kind of personal access and intimate relationship that her religious vows were supposed to make impossible. Caterina's response demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of masculine psychology that she had been developing through her various relationships within Santa Chiara. Instead of either immediate submission or outright rejection, both of which would have ended the relationship in ways that served neither her interests nor his, she expressed the internal conflict that he needed to feel in order to maintain his interest in the pursuit. She acknowledged the genuine attraction she felt toward him as a person, the gratitude she experienced for his concern about her welfare, the loneliness she sometimes felt within the constraints of religious life that made his friendship precious to her. But she also spoke about the sacred commitments that constrained her behavior, the genuine faith that made betrayal of her vows genuinely painful to contemplate, the fear she felt about the spiritual consequences of allowing personal feelings to overcome religious duty. This response provided Count Filippo with exactly what he was seeking: evidence that corrupting her would require genuine effort and involve real moral struggle, that his ultimate success would represent a meaningful victory rather than mere mechanical conquest. The relationship that developed over the following weeks operated on multiple levels of deception and manipulation that served both participants' needs while satisfying neither completely. Count Filippo believed he was gradually seducing an innocent religious woman through patient cultivation of her emotional dependency and careful exploitation of her human need for understanding and companionship. Caterina understood that she was managing a dangerous predator through calculated appeals to his ego and careful manipulation of his need to see himself as irresistibly attractive rather than merely powerful enough to compel submission. Their meetings moved from the formal parlour to more private chambers within the convent, justified by Count Filippo's increasing donations and Suor Margherita's corresponding willingness to accommodate his preferences regarding spiritual council arrangements. These sessions combined elements of intellectual discussion, personal confession, and emotional intimacy in ways that satisfied his need for psychological as well as potential physical conquest while providing her with access to information and resources that expanded her capabilities for managing her growing network of secret relationships. But the most significant development was Count Filippo's gradual introduction into the hidden spaces within Santa Chiara that Caterina had discovered and begun to develop. His curiosity about the convent's architecture, combined with his patron's privilege to examine any aspect of the institution his donation supported, provided perfect cover for exploring passages and chambers that officially did not exist. His resources allowed for improvements to these spaces that made them more comfortable and secure, while his authority ensured that any unusual activity associated with their development could be attributed to legitimate building maintenance rather than clandestine purposes. By winter's end, Count Filippo had become both Caterina's most dangerous relationship and her most valuable asset. His position in Florentine society provided protection and resources that no other connection could offer, but his possessive nature and violent temperament made him a constant threat to the careful balance she was maintaining between her various secret relationships. He believed he was her primary lover and most important patron, unaware that he was actually one element in a complex network of manipulation and deception that she was constructing throughout the male power structure of Renaissance Florence. The irony was that his very possessiveness, which made him dangerous to her other relationships, also made him more vulnerable to her manipulation than any of her other targets. Count Filippo's need to see himself as uniquely attractive and specially favoured created emotional dependencies that she could exploit in ways that would have been impossible with men whose egos were less fragile or whose social positions were less dependent on maintaining appearances of masculine dominance. As spring approached and the anniversary of her first year at Santa Chiara drew near, Caterina had successfully established herself as the secret mistress of one of Florence's most powerful men while maintaining the public appearance of exemplary religious virtue. But she had also created a situation that would require increasingly sophisticated management as her network of relationships expanded and the potential for conflicts between her various lovers grew more dangerous. Count Filippo Orsini represented both the summit of her achievements in manipulating masculine authority and the beginning of complications that would ultimately threaten everything she was building. His protection was invaluable, but his jealousy was potentially lethal. His resources were crucial for her rebellion against religious authority, but his possessiveness threatened to transform liberation into a different kind of imprisonment. Managing him successfully would require all the intelligence and ruthlessness she had developed, and even that might not be sufficient to prevent the explosion that his temperament and her deceptions were making increasingly inevitable. Chapter 7. The Builder's Craft. February morning, when Marco Benedetti first entered Santa Chiara to repair winter storm damage, brought with it the acrid smell of wet stone and the promise of transformation that Caterina had been anticipating since autumn. The storms that had battered Florence throughout January had loosened mortar in several of the convent's ancient walls, created leaks in the roof that threatened the manuscript collection, and damaged sections of flooring that had already been weakened by centuries of use and inadequate maintenance. The repairs required someone with intimate knowledge of medieval construction techniques and the ability to work with materials that matched the building's original fabric, skills that were becoming increasingly rare as Renaissance builders favoured newer methods over traditional craftsmanship. Marco was 35 years old, a widower whose wife had died in the plague outbreak that swept through the artisan quarters 2 years earlier, leaving him alone with skills that commanded respect, but not the social status that would have made remarriage to a woman of appropriate background either possible or desirable. He belonged to that class of Florentine craftsmen whose expertise made them indispensable to the wealthy families and religious institutions that employed them, but whose social position remained permanently subordinate to those they served. His hands were permanently stained with mortar and stone dust, his back bore the marks of decades spent lifting heavy materials, and his face carried the weathered look of someone who had spent most of his adult life working outdoors in all seasons. But what made Marco dangerous to the ordered world of Santa Chiara was not his technical knowledge alone, or the combination of practical intelligence with emotional vulnerability that his recent loss had created. The death of his wife had left him isolated within a social structure that had no place for solitary men of his class, cut off from the domestic relationships that had previously anchored his identity and provided meaning for his daily labour. He worked now with the desperate focus of someone who had discovered that physical exhaustion was the only reliable remedy for grief, that complex problems requiring complete concentration were the only activities that could distract him from the emptiness that characterized his private life. Caterina had been observing him for days before she engineered their first direct contact, watching from the high windows of her cell as he examined the building's exterior walls, noting the careful attention he paid to details that other workmen might have overlooked, recognizing in his methodical approach the kind of perfectionist mentality that she could exploit for her own purposes. The architectural drawings she'd discovered in Mother Superior's chamber had revealed the location of concealed passages and hidden chambers, but actualizing access to these spaces would require construction skills that she did not possess and could not acquire without assistance from someone who understood medieval building techniques. The opportunity for recruitment presented itself when Marco's inspection revealed damage to a section of wall that, according to the architectural plans, concealed one of the major passage entrances. The repairs he recommended would require removing several layers of later construction that had obscured the original medieval stonework, creating the perfect opportunity to discover the concealed entrance while appearing to conduct legitimate maintenance activities. But convincing him to undertake work that went beyond the minimal repairs actually required would demand careful manipulation of his professional pride and personal psychology. Their first conversation took place in the convent's main corridor, where Marco was examining stone blocks that had been loosened by water infiltration during the winter storms. Caterina approached him under the pretense of concern about disruption to the sister's prayer schedule, but her real purpose was to assess his personality and identify the psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to secure his cooperation in activities that would go far beyond building maintenance. What she discovered was a man whose recent tragedy had left him hungry for human connection, while simultaneously suspicious of attempts to provide it. Protective of his professional reputation while desperate for recognition of his skills, proud of his craftsmanship while acutely aware of his subordinate social position. The death of his wife had eliminated the primary relationship that had provided emotional stability and personal identity, but it had also freed him from domestic obligations that might have prevented him from undertaking projects that required extensive time commitment and personal risk. Marco's response to her questions about the repair work revealed both technical expertise and aesthetic sensitivity that went beyond mere practical competence. He spoke about the beauty of medieval stonework, the elegance of construction techniques that modern builders no longer understood, the satisfaction that came from restoring ancient craftsmanship to its original condition. But he also expressed frustration with patrons who demanded quick fixes, rather than proper restoration, who prioritized immediate cost savings over long-term structural integrity, who failed to appreciate the artistry involved in working with materials and methods that required genuine understanding rather than mere mechanical application. This combination of professional passion and personal isolation provided exactly the psychological profile that Caterina needed for her purposes. Marco possessed the technical skills required for accessing and improving the concealed spaces within Santa Chiara, but he also had emotional needs that could be satisfied through careful cultivation of personal relationship disguised as appreciation for his professional abilities. His recent loss had made him vulnerable to feminine attention, while his social position ensured that such attention would be rare enough to seem precious when it was offered. The seduction began with expressions of genuine interest in his work that gradually revealed her own knowledge of architectural principles and construction techniques, information she had acquired through careful study of the drawings hidden in Mother Superior's chamber, but which she presented as evidence of family background in building trades and natural curiosity about craftsmanship. This demonstration of informed appreciation for his skills created immediate rapport and established her credibility as someone whose opinions about his work deserved serious consideration. But what transformed professional respect into personal attraction was Caterina's recognition and acknowledgement of Marco's grief in ways that validated his loss, while offering the possibility of emotional healing through renewed human connection. She spoke about the loneliness that came with religious life, the difficulty of maintaining hope and purpose when daily existence was defined by separation from normal human relationships. She expressed admiration for his ability to continue creating beautiful work despite personal tragedy, understanding for the way grief could make even routine tasks feel overwhelming and meaningless. These conversations took place during work breaks in small chambers, where Marco's repair activities provided legitimate reasons for private meetings away from the surveillance that monitored most interactions within the convent. The practical necessity of discussing construction details provided cover for increasingly personal exchanges that revealed mutual loneliness and created emotional intimacy that both participants began to value more highly than professional collaboration. The transformation from emotional intimacy to physical attraction occurred gradually, through a series of encounters where shared work on architectural projects created opportunities for casual physical contact that gradually became more intentional and prolonged. Marco's demonstrations of construction techniques required close proximity and occasional guidance of Caterina's hands as she learned to work with tools and materials, creating legitimate reasons for touching that satisfied both participants' hunger for human contact while maintaining the fiction that their relationship remained focused on building maintenance activities. But the real breakthrough came when Marco's examination of the damaged wall section revealed evidence of the concealed construction that Caterina already knew existed there. His discovery of irregularities in the stonework that suggested hidden spaces behind apparently solid surfaces provided the perfect opportunity to propose expanded investigation that would so serve both his professional curiosity and her strategic objectives. The project that began as routine repair work transformed into architectural exploration that would require extensive private collaboration and mutual trust of the kind that could justify ongoing secret meetings and emotional intimacy. Marco's entrance into the concealed passages and hidden chambers that Caterina had already discovered marked the beginning of their transition from strategic relationship to something approaching genuine partnership. His technical knowledge revealed possibilities for expanding and improving these spaces that she had not previously recognized, while his practical skills made it possible to implement modifications that would enhance their security and comfort. But more importantly, His emotional investment in the work provided personal motivation for maintaining absolute secrecy about activities that could destroy both their lives if discovered by religious or secular authorities. The hidden chamber became their shared workspace and private retreat, a place where the normal constraints of religious life and social hierarchy no longer applied, where a supposedly enclosed nun and a working-class craftsman could collaborate as equals in projects that served their mutual interests in creating spaces beyond official supervision and control. Marco's improvements to the chamber, better ventilation, more secure concealment mechanisms, furniture designed specifically for the space's unusual requirements, transformed it from mere hiding place into comfortable living quarters that could support extended occupation and complex activities. But what made their relationship different from Caterina's other secret connections was the element of genuine reciprocity that developed between them, despite the calculated nature of its origins. Where Father Lorenzo provided intellectual stimulation, Giuliano offered cultural resources, and Count Filippo supplied political protection. Marco contributed both practical assistance and emotional companionship that satisfied needs she had not previously acknowledged. His simple acceptance of her complexity, his appreciation for her intelligence combined with recognition of her humanity, created a form of intimacy that was less strategic and more authentic than anything she had experienced since entering religious life. This authenticity created complications that threatened the careful emotional detachment she maintained with her other lovers. Marco's genuine affection for her, as a person, rather than mere fascination with her, as a forbidden conquest, made it increasingly difficult to view their relationship purely in terms of strategic advantage and resource acquisition. His vulnerability to emotional pain made manipulation feel cruel in ways that had not concerned her when dealing with men whose social positions protected them from serious consequences of romantic disappointment. But even as their relationship developed emotional dimensions that went beyond strategic calculation, Caterina remained acutely aware that Marco's practical contributions were essential for the expansion of her rebellion against religious authority. His construction skills made it possible to create additional concealed spaces throughout Santa Chiara, to establish secure communication networks between different parts of the building, to develop storage areas for materials and supplies that would support increasingly complex secret activities. His knowledge of the building trades provided information about other craftsmen who might be recruited for similar purposes, while his social connections within the artisan community offered possibilities for expanding her influence beyond the immediate confines of the convent. Most crucially, Marco's modifications to the concealed spaces created the infrastructure necessary for accommodating multiple secret relationships simultaneously, without risk of accidental discovery or conflict between different lovers who were unaware of each other's existence. The chambers and passages he constructed provided separate routes of access, soundproofed meeting areas, and storage facilities for gifts and correspondence that allowed Caterina to maintain distinct relationships with different men without any of them suspecting the existence of the others. Chapter 8. The Physician's Anatomy. The arrival of Dr. Alessandro Tornabuoni at Santa Chiara in late spring brought with it the antiseptic smell of medical preparations and the unsettling presence of someone whose professional training had taught him to see through surface appearances to underlying realities that others preferred to keep hidden. The convent's previous physician, an elderly man whose understanding of medical practice had been shaped more by medieval tradition than contemporary knowledge, had died during the winter, leaving Santa Chiara in need of someone whose skills reflected the advances in anatomical understanding that were revolutionizing Renaissance medicine. Alessandro was 31 years old, educated at the University of Padua, where he had studied with physicians who practiced dissection despite religious prohibitions, and trained in diagnostic methods that emphasized careful observation and logical analysis rather than reliance on traditional authorities and inherited assumptions. But what made Alessandro truly dangerous was not just his medical expertise, but the scientific mentality that led him to approach all phenomena, including human behavior, with the systematic curiosity of someone accustomed to discovering hidden truths through patient investigation. He had been shaped by the new learning that emphasized empirical observation over received wisdom, that encouraged questioning of traditional explanations when evidence suggested alternative interpretations. This intellectual approach made him formidable as a physician, but it also made him the kind of person who might notice inconsistencies and patterns that would escape the attention of observers who were content to accept surface appearances without deeper investigation. Alessandro's appointment to serve Santa Chiara reflected both the convent's prestige as an institution that could attract the most qualified professionals and the practical reality that his own circumstances made him available for a position that more established physicians might have declined. His family background was respectable but not wealthy. His education had been financed through scholarships and patronage rather than inherited wealth, and his career prospects depended on building a reputation through successful service to important clients rather than relying on family connections to secure prestigious appointments. But his personal history also included elements that made him psychologically vulnerable to the kind of manipulation that Caterina had been perfecting through her relationships with other men who served Santa Chiara in various official capacities. Alessandro had recently ended a relationship with a woman whose family had rejected his marriage proposal on economic grounds, leaving him isolated from the kind of domestic companionship that his social position should have provided. His dedication to medical studies had absorbed most of his time and attention during his 20s, preventing him from developing the social connections that might have led to appropriate romantic partnerships, while his scientific interests had created intellectual needs that few women of his acquaintance were educated to satisfy. Caterina's first encounter with Alessandro occurred when she deliberately induced symptoms that required medical attention, a combination of restricted eating and carefully managed physical stress that created the appearance of illness serious enough to justify consultation with the convent's new physician. The condition she presented was complex enough to require detailed examination and ongoing monitoring, providing opportunities for private meetings that could develop into more extensive relationships, but not so severe as to cause genuine concern or attract unwanted attention from religious authorities who might investigate the circumstances surrounding her health problems. Alessandro's examination revealed both his medical competence and his susceptibility to intellectual attraction that could be exploited for purposes that went far beyond healthcare. His questions about her symptoms demonstrated systematic diagnostic thinking, but they also revealed genuine curiosity about the psychological and social factors that might contribute to physical illness in the unique environment of religious enclosure. He was interested not just in treating her immediate condition, but in understanding the broader implications of conventual life for women's health and welfare. This intellectual approach provided exactly the opening that Caterina needed to establish herself as something more than a routine patient requiring standard medical care. Instead of simply describing her physical symptoms and accepting whatever treatment he prescribed, she engaged with his questions about the relationship between mental and physical health in ways that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of medical theory and genuine interest in the scientific principles underlying contemporary healthcare practices. Their discussions revealed that she possessed knowledge of anatomical principles, understanding of diagnostic procedures, and familiarity with recent developments in medical practice that should have been far beyond the education available to women, especially women in religious life. This unexpected intellectual capacity created immediate fascination and respect that transformed their relationship from conventional physician-patient interaction into something approaching professional consultation between colleagues. But what made these medical consultations truly dangerous was the way they created legitimate opportunities for physical examination and intimate conversation that would have been impossible to justify under any other circumstances. Alessandro's professional duties required him to ask detailed questions about Caterina's bodily functions, emotional states, and personal history that provided insights into her psychology and circumstances, while establishing patterns of private communication that could be developed for purposes having nothing to do with healthcare. The examination process itself created a form of controlled intimacy that satisfied both participants' hunger for human connection while maintaining the fiction of appropriate professional behavior. Alessandro's medical training had taught him to approach the human body with scientific detachment, but it had not prepared him for encounters with patients whose intelligence and personality made clinical objectivity increasingly difficult to maintain. Caterina's responses to his examinations demonstrated both the vulnerability that came with physical exposure and the confidence that suggested she was accustomed to being appreciated as well as merely treated. But the real transformation in their relationship occurred when Alessandro began to share his own intellectual interests and professional challenges in ways that created mutual rather than one-sided revelation. He spoke about his frustration with medical practice that was constrained by religious restrictions on anatomical investigation, his excitement about new discoveries in human physiology, that challenged traditional understanding of health and disease, his isolation within a professional community that was often hostile to innovations that threatened established authorities and conventional wisdom. These confessions created opportunities for Caterina to demonstrate not just passive understanding of his concerns, but active engagement with the scientific questions that most interested him. She revealed knowledge of classical medical authorities like Galen and Avicenna, familiarity with contemporary developments in anatomical study, and most remarkably, theoretical insights about the relationship between mind and body that enhanced rather than merely reflected his own thinking about medical practice. The conversations that developed during their weekly consultations ranged far beyond healthcare into broader questions about the nature of human knowledge, the relationship between empirical observation and theoretical understanding, the implications of recent scientific discoveries for traditional religious and philosophical beliefs about human nature and destiny. These discussions satisfied intellectual needs that neither participant had been able to address through their normal social relationships, creating a form of companionship that seemed increasingly precious and irreplaceable. But Alessandro's scientific training also made him potentially the most dangerous of Caterina's lovers, because his professional habits of careful observation and logical analysis could lead him to notice patterns and inconsistencies that others might miss. Where Father Lorenzo was distracted by emotional turmoil, Giuliano was focused on cultural and commercial interests. Count Filippo was blinded by arrogance and possessiveness, and Marco was absorbed in practical construction projects. Alessandro was trained to look for evidence that contradicted surface appearances and to investigate anomalies that might reveal underlying realities. This meant that managing their relationship required a level of sophistication and careful planning that exceeded anything she had previously attempted. Alessandro's attraction to her mind was genuine, his respect for her intelligence was authentic, and his growing romantic feelings were based on substantial understanding of her actual personality rather than fantasy projections. But his very perceptiveness made deception more difficult, and discovery more likely if she made any significant errors in maintaining the complex network of secret relationships that now defined her daily existence. The solution she developed was to use Alessandro's scientific curiosity as a tool for deepening his emotional investment, while simultaneously providing him with partial truths that would satisfy his investigative instincts without revealing the full extent of her activities. She began to share carefully selected information about her discoveries regarding Santa Chiara's architectural anomalies, presenting them as historical curiosities that appealed to his intellectual interests while providing legitimate reasons for requesting his assistance with exploration that would serve her own purposes. Alessandro's medical knowledge proved invaluable for understanding the practical requirements of maintaining health and comfort in the concealed spaces that Marco had been developing throughout the building. His understanding of ventilation requirements, sanitation needs, and environmental factors that affected human wellness made it possible to create hidden chambers that could support extended occupation without creating health hazards that might lead to discovery through illness or other medical emergencies. But more importantly, Alessandro's scientific approach to problem-solving provided analytical frameworks that enhanced Caterina's ability to manage the psychological and logistical challenges of maintaining multiple secret relationships simultaneously. His systematic thinking about complex phenomena helped her develop more sophisticated strategies for scheduling meetings, managing resources, and preventing conflicts between different lovers who remained unaware of each other's existence. The development of genuine intellectual partnership with Alessandro created complications that threatened the emotional detachment she tried to maintain in all her strategic relationships. His scientific rationality combined with personal vulnerability created a form of companionship that satisfied needs she had not previously acknowledged, while his genuine respect for her intelligence, as distinct from mere fascination with her forbidden status, made manipulation feel increasingly problematic from an emotional standpoint. But even as their relationship developed authentic dimensions that went beyond strategic calculation, Caterina remained aware that Alessandro's position in Florentine medical circles provided access to information and resources that could prove crucial for protecting her expanding network of secret activities. His professional connections included relationships with other physicians, university-educated intellectuals, and wealthy families who required medical services, creating opportunities for expanding her influence beyond the immediate confines of Santa Chiara. Most significantly, Alessandro's medical authority provided perfect cover for activities that might otherwise arouse suspicion from religious or secular authorities who monitored the convent for evidence of inappropriate behavior. His legitimate professional reasons for private meetings detailed physical examinations, and ongoing consultation about health matters, created a framework within which their actual relationship could develop without attracting the kind of attention that would destroy everything she had built. By midsummer, Alessandro had become both her most intellectually satisfying lover and her most dangerous liability. His scientific training made him capable of providing insights and assistance that enhanced every aspect of her rebellion against religious authority, but it also made him more likely than any of her other partners to discover inconsistencies or evidence that could expose the full extent of her network of deception. Managing him successfully required balancing his need for intellectual honesty with her requirement for operational security, satisfying his scientific curiosity while preventing him from investigating areas that could lead to discoveries that would destroy them all. The hidden chambers had become not just meeting places, but laboratories where Alessandro's medical knowledge combined with Marco's construction skills to create facilities that could support increasingly complex activities while maintaining absolute secrecy from official supervision. But they had also become spaces where the boundaries between strategic manipulation and authentic relationship were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, where Caterina's carefully planned rebellion was developing emotional complications that threatened to transform calculated liberation into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The summer heat that made the stone corridors of Santa Chiara oppressive during daylight hours also made the concealed chambers more comfortable for extended occupation, creating opportunities for longer meetings and more intimate relationships that served both participants' growing need for genuine companionship while advancing the larger project of systematic subversion of religious authority through the weaponization of masculine desire and intellectual curiosity. But as autumn approached and the anniversary of Alessandro's appointment drew near, both Caterina and her newest lover understood that their relationship had developed beyond anything that medical necessity could justify or professional propriety could contain. The scientific method that had initially provided framework for their connection was now being applied to questions about human emotion and personal commitment that had implications extending far beyond healthcare into the territory where discovery could mean not just professional disgrace but physical destruction for everyone involved. Chapter 9. The Artisan's Gold. The October morning, when Pietro Salvatore first entered Santa Chiara, brought with it the distinctive scent of heated metal and the soft chiming of silver tools against precious materials that spoke of craftsmanship elevated to the level of art. He came bearing commissions for new liturgical objects, a golden chalice to replace one damaged beyond repair, silver candlesticks for the high altar, and a jewelled reliquary that would house sacred remains recently acquired through the generous donation of Count Filippo Orsini. But Pietro was not merely another craftsman seeking payment for routine religious metalwork. He was an artist whose reputation for creating objects of extraordinary beauty had made him sought after by the wealthiest families and the most prestigious religious institutions throughout Tuscany. Pietro was 29 years old, possessed of the kind of intense creative temperament that made him capable of producing work of transcendent beauty while simultaneously making him difficult to employ for clients who valued punctuality and predictability over artistic excellence. His workshop in the Oltrarno district had become legendary among Florence's cultural elite for producing pieces that combined technical perfection with imaginative design in ways that transformed functional objects into works of art worthy of display in the greatest palaces and churches. But his artistic genius was complicated by emotional volatility and romantic idealism that made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of sophisticated manipulation that Caterina had been perfecting through her relationships with other men who served Santa Chiara in various professional capacities. What made Pietro dangerous to the ordered world of religious discipline was not just his artistic talent, but the way his creative sensibility led him to see beauty as a form of divine revelation that transcended conventional distinctions between sacred and profane, spiritual and physical, appropriate and forbidden. He had been trained in the Florentine tradition that viewed artistic excellence as a pathway to understanding God's creative power, that saw no contradiction between appreciation for human beauty and worship of divine perfection. This aesthetic philosophy made him naturally rebellious against forms of religious authority that demanded suppression of all pleasure in sensory experience, all appreciation for physical beauty, all recognition that human creativity could reflect divine inspiration. Pietro's entry into Santa Chiara occurred at a moment when Caterina's network of secret relationships had reached a level of complexity that required increasingly sophisticated management to prevent discovery or conflict between different lovers who remained unaware of each other's existence. Father Lorenzo provided spiritual rebellion and intellectual companionship. Giuliano offered cultural resources and commercial connections. Count Filippo supplied political protection and material wealth. Marco contributed practical skills and emotional partnership. And Alessandro delivered medical expertise and scientific rationality. But what she still lacked was access to the artistic community that was transforming Renaissance Florence, connection to the creative circles where beauty was celebrated rather than condemned, where human passion was seen as reflecting rather than contradicting divine love. Pietro's initial consultation with the convent's leadership about the commissioned liturgical objects provided the first opportunity for Caterina to assess his personality and identify the psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to secure his cooperation in activities that would go far beyond metalworking. What she discovered was an artist whose creative passion had never found adequate expression in romantic relationships with women who possessed neither the cultural sophistication to appreciate his work nor the emotional complexity to engage with his tempestuous artistic temperament. The women of Pietro's social class, respectable but not wealthy, educated in domestic skills but not cultural refinement, were capable of providing practical partnership and social stability, but they could not offer the kind of intellectual and aesthetic companionship that his artistic nature demanded. The noble women who possessed appropriate cultural education were beyond his social reach, while the courtesans who might have provided sophisticated companionship operated in circles where his relatively modest wealth could not compete with the resources of truly wealthy patrons. This combination of artistic genius and romantic frustration created exactly the psychological profile that Caterina needed for her purposes. Pietro possessed skills that could be invaluable for enhancing the concealed spaces within Santa Chiara, while also providing access to cultural circles that could expand her influence beyond religious and commercial communities. But he also had emotional needs that could be satisfied through careful cultivation of artistic and romantic partnership disguised as appreciation for his creative abilities and understanding of his aesthetic vision. The seduction began with demonstrations of genuine appreciation for Pietro's artistic philosophy that revealed her own sophisticated understanding of the relationship between beauty, creativity, and spiritual experience. During their initial conversations about the liturgical commissions, Caterina spoke knowledgeably about the symbolic meanings incorporated into religious metalwork, the theological principles that should guide artistic representation of divine mysteries, and the practical considerations that affected the creation of objects intended for ceremonial use. But she also expressed ideas about the relationship between human creativity and divine inspiration that went far beyond conventional religious orthodoxy into territory that most clergy would have considered theologically dangerous. This intellectual engagement with his artistic concerns created immediate rapport and established her credibility as someone whose opinions about his work deserved serious consideration. But what transformed professional respect into personal fascination was Caterina's ability to articulate aesthetic theories that Pietro had intuited but never been able to express clearly, to provide philosophical frameworks that gave intellectual substance to creative instincts that he had previously trusted without fully understanding. Their conversations about religious art gradually expanded into broader discussions of beauty as a pathway to understanding divine truth, creativity as participation in God's ongoing work of creation, and physical pleasure as reflection, rather than contradiction of spiritual joy. These ideas challenge conventional religious teaching about the separation between sacred and profane, but they also provided intellectual justification for artistic and romantic pursuits that official doctrine condemned as dangerous distractions from properly spiritual concerns. The practical collaboration on liturgical objects provided opportunities for extended private meetings where discussions of artistic techniques created legitimate reasons for physical proximity and casual contact that gradually became more intentional and intimate. Pietro's demonstrations of metalworking methods required close observation of hand movements and careful attention to subtle details that necessitated standing or sitting very close together, creating natural opportunities for touching that satisfied both participants' hunger for human contact while maintaining the fiction that their relationship remained focused on professional artistic collaboration. But the real transformation in their relationship occurred when Pietro began to incorporate hidden elements into the liturgical objects he was creating for Santa Chiara. Secret compartments, concealed mechanisms, and removable sections that could serve purposes having nothing to do with religious ceremony. These modifications were ostensibly artistic flourishes that demonstrated his technical virtuosity and creative imagination, but they actually provided secure storage for correspondence, small valuable objects, and other materials that needed to be concealed from official inspection. The creation of these hidden elements required detailed consultation about their intended purposes, extensive collaboration on their design and implementation, and absolute trust regarding their concealment from religious authorities who would consider such modifications evidence of inappropriate activities requiring investigation and punishment. This shared project created a form of conspiracy that bonded Pietro and Caterina together through mutual dependence and shared risk in ways that went far beyond romantic attraction or professional cooperation. Pietro's entrance into the concealed spaces that Marco had been developing throughout Santa Chiara marked his full transition from professional collaborator to active participant in systematic rebellion against religious authority. His artistic skills made it possible to transform the hidden chambers from mere functional spaces into environments of genuine beauty and comfort that could support extended occupation and complex activities while maintaining their concealment from official supervision. But more importantly, Pietro's aesthetic sensibility brought a dimension to the concealed spaces that enhanced their psychological as well as practical value. His understanding of how environmental beauty affected human emotions and behavior led to modifications that made the hidden chambers not just secure and comfortable, but genuinely pleasant places where the participants in secret relationships could experience forms of joy and satisfaction that were systematically denied by the official structures of religious life. The golden objects that Pietro had created for public display in Santa Chiara's chapel became symbols of the fundamental deception that now characterized every aspect of the convent's existence. Each chalice, candlesticks, and reliquary appeared to represent proper religious devotion and appropriate use of donated wealth for sacred purposes, but each also contained hidden compartments where evidence of forbidden relationships was stored, where communications between secret lovers were concealed, where the material resources supporting systematic transgression were kept beyond the reach of official discovery. But what made Pietro's relationship with Caterina different from her other secret connections was the element of genuine artistic collaboration that developed between them, despite the calculated nature of its origins. Where her other lovers contributed resources, protection, practical skills, or intellectual stimulation that served primarily instrumental purposes, Pietro provided creative partnership that satisfied aesthetic needs she had not previously acknowledged, and artistic experiences that were valuable for their own sake rather than merely as means to other ends. This creative collaboration created complications that threatened the careful emotional management she maintained in all her strategic relationships. Pietro's romantic idealism and artistic passion made him more emotionally vulnerable than her other lovers, while his creative temperament made him more likely to act impulsively in ways that could compromise the security of their shared activities. His need to see their relationship as transcendent artistic and romantic partnership rather than calculated strategic alliance made deception increasingly difficult and emotionally problematic. But even as their relationship developed authentic dimensions that went beyond strategic calculation, Caterina remained aware that Pietro's position in Florence's artistic community provided access to cultural circles that could prove invaluable for expanding her network of influence and support. His professional connections included relationships with other artists, wealthy patrons, and cultural innovators who operated on the margins of conventional society and might be receptive to forms of rebellion that challenged traditional religious and social authority. Most significantly, Pietro's artistic philosophy provided intellectual justification for activities that could otherwise be dismissed as mere self-indulgence or criminal transgression. His belief that beauty was a pathway to divine truth, that creativity reflected divine inspiration, and that physical pleasure could enhance, rather than compromise spiritual development, offered theological and philosophical frameworks that transformed secret relationships from simple violations of religious law into forms of spiritual exploration that served higher purposes than conventional obedience to institutional authority. By winter, Pietro had become both Caterina's most artistically fulfilling lover and her most emotionally demanding relationship. His creative genius enhanced every aspect of the concealed spaces and secret activities that now defined her daily existence, but his romantic idealism and emotional, volatility made him potentially dangerous to the careful balance she was maintaining between multiple relationships that remained hidden from each other as well as from official supervision. The hidden chambers had become not just meeting places, but artistic workshops where Pietro's metalworking skills, combined with Marco's construction abilities and Alessandro's scientific knowledge, to create facilities that could support increasingly sophisticated activities while maintaining absolute secrecy from religious and secular authorities. But they had also become spaces where the boundaries between strategic manipulation and authentic artistic collaboration were becoming impossible to maintain, where Caterina's carefully planned rebellion was developing creative dimensions that threatened to transform calculated liberation into something far more complex and unpredictable. The liturgical objects that Pietro created for public display in Santa Chiara became masterpieces of double meaning, works of genuine religious art that also served as monuments to successful deception, beautiful expressions of conventional devotion that simultaneously celebrated the systematic subversion of everything such devotion was supposed to represent. Each golden surface reflected light during religious services while concealing darkness that would have horrified the worshippers who admired their beauty without understanding their true significance. As the seasons turned and Pietro's commissions for Santa Chiara were completed, both he and Caterina understood that their artistic collaboration had created bonds that could not be severed simply by concluding professional relationships. The objects he had created would remain permanently within the convent as evidence of their partnership, while the skills and knowledge he had contributed to developing the concealed spaces would continue to serve purposes that went far beyond anything that aesthetic theory or religious art could justify or contain. The golden thread that connected Pietro's artistic vision to Caterina's systematic rebellion against religious authority had become woven so tightly into the fabric of daily life at Santa Chiara that removing it would require unravelling everything she had built over months of careful planning and patient execution. But maintaining it would require managing emotional and creative energies that operated according to their own logic rather than strategic calculation, that demanded authentic response rather than calculated manipulation, that threatened to transform the liberation through deception into something approaching genuine love, the most dangerous development of all, in a world where discovery meant death for everyone involved. Chapter 10. The Clockwork of Desire. By the spring of 1501, 3 years after her transformation from Alessandra Strozzi into Sister Caterina, she had achieved something that should have been impossible within the confines of medieval religious architecture and Renaissance surveillance culture. 5 men moved through her life with the precision of clockwork, each believing himself to be her sole transgression against religious vows, each providing different forms of support and companionship that together created a parallel existence of remarkable freedom and complexity within the supposedly absolute constraints of enclosed religious life. The system she had constructed required mathematical precision in scheduling, psychological sophistication in management, and architectural ingenuity in execution that surpassed anything achieved by the secular courtesans who operated openly in Florence's commercial districts. The temporal choreography alone represented a masterpiece of logistical planning that would have challenged the organizational abilities of merchants managing international trading enterprises. Father Lorenzo maintained his weekly confessional appointments on Tuesday afternoons, sessions that had evolved from spiritual guidance into intellectual and emotional intimacy, conducted through carefully coded theological discussions. Giuliano Vespucci visited Thursday mornings under the continuing pretext of the manuscript consultations, meetings that now took place entirely within the concealed chambers where his commercial knowledge and cultural resources supported activities that had nothing to do with religious art or scholarly research. Count Filippo Orsini exercised his patron's privilege for private spiritual conferences on Saturday evenings, encounters that satisfied his need for psychological domination while providing Caterina with political protection and material resources that made all her other relationships possible. Marco Benedetti's construction and maintenance work created opportunities for Monday and Wednesday meetings that combined practical collaboration on expanding the hidden spaces with emotional partnership that had become increasingly genuine despite its calculated origins. Alessandro Tornabuoni's medical consultations occurred on Friday afternoons, sessions that blended healthcare with scientific discussion and romantic companionship in ways that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Pietro Salvatore's schedule was the most complex because his artistic temperament made him resistant to rigid temporal constraints, but his visits were coordinated around the delivery and installation of liturgical objects that provided perfect cover for extended private meetings focused on creative collaboration that enhanced both the aesthetic and functional qualities of the concealed spaces throughout Santa Chiara. But the true genius of the system lay not in its scheduling complexity alone, but in the way each relationship had been constructed to serve different psychological and practical needs, while remaining completely isolated from the others. Father Lorenzo satisfied her intellectual hunger for theological and philosophical discussion while providing spiritual justification for activities that violated every principle of religious orthodoxy. Giuliano offered access to humanist culture and commercial networks while supplying materials and resources that could not be obtained through religious channels. Count Filippo delivered political protection and substantial wealth while satisfying his own need for dominance through carefully managed submission that made him feel powerful while actually serving her purposes. Marco provided practical skills and emotional companionship that enhanced both the physical infrastructure and the psychological sustainability of her rebellion against religious authority. Alessandro contributed medical expertise and scientific rationality that ensured the health and safety of all participants, while offering intellectual stimulation that challenged conventional assumptions about human nature and social organization. Pietro supplied artistic vision and creative collaboration that transformed the hidden spaces from mere functional facilities into environments of genuine beauty, where forbidden relationships could flourish in settings that reflected their participants' highest aspirations, rather than their lowest compromises. The concealed chambers themselves had evolved into a complex network of specialized spaces that served different functions and accommodated different relationships according to their particular requirements. The original chamber that Caterina had discovered contained her private study and meeting room, furnished with books, writing materials, and comfortable seating that supported extended intellectual discussions and intimate conversations. Marco's construction work had created additional chambers connected by passages that allowed movement throughout the building without using any of the monitored corridors or official rooms. One chamber served as Alessandro's medical consultation room, equipped with materials and instruments that supported both legitimate healthcare activities and more personal forms of physical intimacy that required privacy and comfort impossible to achieve in conventional medical settings. Another had been developed as Pietro's workshop, where artistic projects could be pursued without interference from religious authorities who might question the appropriateness of creative activities that went beyond basic liturgical requirements. The most luxurious chamber had been created specifically for meetings with Count Filippo, furnished with expensive fabrics and decorative objects that satisfied his aristocratic expectations, while providing a setting where his need for dominance could be managed through psychological manipulation disguised as romantic submission. Giuliano's space reflected his humanist interests and commercial background, equipped with writing materials, manuscript collections, and comfortable furnishings that supported the intellectual and cultural activities that characterized their relationship. But the practical infrastructure was only one component of a system that also required sophisticated psychological management to prevent conflicts between different lovers who remained unaware of each other's existence. Each man had been led to believe that his relationship with Sister Caterina represented her first and only transgression against religious vows, that his particular combination of attraction and circumstance had succeeded in corrupting virtue that had previously remained intact despite other temptations and opportunities. This deception required careful attention to emotional dynamics that could reveal inconsistencies or create suspicions about activities that supposedly did not exist. Father Lorenzo needed to feel that his intellectual connection with Caterina was unique and irreplaceable, that no one else could provide the kind of theological discussion and spiritual companionship that had made their transgression seem inevitable despite religious obligations. Giuliano required assurance that his respect for her intelligence and appreciation for her cultural sophistication had awakened romantic feelings that she had never experienced with anyone else. Count Filippo's ego demanded confirmation that his wealth and social position had succeeded in seducing innocence that lesser men could never have corrupted, that his particular combination of power and charm had overcome religious resistance that would have defeated any other approach. Marco needed to believe that his emotional support and practical assistance had created genuine affection that transcended the strategic considerations governing other aspects of her religious life. Alessandro wanted confirmation that their intellectual partnership and scientific collaboration represented mutual recognition of exceptional compatibility that could not be replicated with anyone else. Pietro's romantic idealism required the most careful management because his artistic temperament made him prone to emotional extremes that could compromise operational security if not properly controlled. He needed to feel that their creative collaboration represented transcendent artistic and romantic partnership that elevated physical attraction to the level of spiritual communion, that their shared aesthetic vision created bonds that surpassed ordinary human relationships in ways that justified transgression against conventional religious and social constraints. Maintaining these complex emotional deceptions required not just careful scheduling and physical security, but sophisticated understanding of masculine psychology that allowed Caterina to provide each lover with exactly the type of relationship he most desired, while preventing any of them from recognizing that their supposedly unique connection was actually one element in a larger network of strategic relationships. The conversations she conducted with each man were tailored to his particular intellectual interests, emotional needs, and psychological vulnerabilities in ways that created powerful feelings of intimacy and exclusivity despite the artificial nature of their construction. But the most remarkable aspect of the system was the way it had transformed Santa Chiara itself from an institution designed to suppress female agency into a space where feminine intelligence and determination could operate with remarkable freedom despite official constraints that should have made any significant autonomy impossible. The convent that appeared from outside to represent successful religious discipline and appropriate enclosure of women actually contained a parallel world where different rules applied, where relationships developed according to their participants' preferences rather than institutional requirements, where intellectual, artistic, and romantic activities flourished beyond the reach of official supervision. The irony was that this alternative world could exist precisely because the official world assumed its impossibility so completely that adequate surveillance was never implemented to detect its presence. Religious and secular authorities operated from assumptions about enclosed women that made sophisticated deception unimaginable, that attributed to religious vows a power over human behavior that experience should have taught them was unrealistic, that underestimated both the intelligence and the determination of women whose circumstances demanded creative approaches to achieving basic human dignity and satisfaction. But the success of the system also created vulnerabilities that became more dangerous as its complexity increased. Each additional relationship multiplied the possibilities for accidental discovery, schedule conflicts, or emotional complications that could expose everything to authorities whose response would be swift and merciless. The skills required to manage multiple sophisticated men simultaneously demanded constant attention and perfect execution that left no room for errors or lapses in judgment. More dangerously, the emotional authenticity that made several of the relationships genuinely satisfying also made them harder to control through purely strategic manipulation. The growing attachment between Caterina and Marco, the intellectual partnership with Alessandro, and the creative collaboration with Pietro created feelings and commitments that operated according to their own logic, rather than calculated advantage, that demanded responses based on genuine emotion rather than tactical necessity. The system that had been designed to provide liberation through deception was developing authentic dimensions that threatened to transform careful rebellion into something approaching genuine love, a development that could prove fatal in circumstances where discovery meant death for all participants. The clockwork precision that had made complex relationships possible was beginning to be complicated by human emotions that operate according to less predictable rhythms that demanded satisfaction of needs that could not be met through strategic calculation alone. As summer approached and the 4th anniversary of her entrance into Santa Chiara drew near, Caterina stood at the center of a network of relationships and activities that represented the most successful systematic rebellion against religious authority in the history of Renaissance Florence. But she also stood on the edge of complications that could destroy everything she had built, caught between the strategic thinking that had made her success possible and the human emotions that were making its continuation increasingly difficult to sustain. The bells that called the sisters to prayer each day now marked not just the official schedule of religious observance, but the complex temporal choreography of forbidden relationships that had transformed Santa Chiara from a prison into a stage where the most elaborate deception in Florentine history continued to unfold with clockwork precision. But clocks, no matter how perfectly constructed, eventually require winding. and the spring that had been driving Caterina's rebellion was beginning to show signs of the stress that comes from maintaining perfect tension over extended periods of time. Chapter 11. The Inquisitor's Eye. The arrival of Brother Francesco Salviati at Santa Chiara on a fog-shrouded morning in September brought with it the antiseptic chill of systematic investigation and the particular brand of terror that came from encountering someone whose intelligence matched his absolute conviction in the righteousness of his cause. He was 34 years old, trained not just in theology, but in the investigative methodologies that the Church had developed over centuries of rooting out heresy, corruption, and deception within its own institutions. Unlike the local clergy who had previously conducted routine inspections of Santa Chiara, Brother Francesco represented the specialized apparatus that Savonarola had created to ensure that religious reform penetrated to the deepest levels of institutional life, eliminating not just obvious transgressions, but the subtle forms of compromise and accommodation that allowed corruption to flourish beneath surfaces of apparent orthodoxy. What made Brother Francesco truly dangerous was not just his authority or his investigative training, but the methodical intelligence that led him to approach every assignment with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that the most serious deceptions were precisely those that appeared most innocent to casual observation. He had been educated at the University of Bologna in both canon law and natural philosophy, had studied the techniques of interrogation and evidence analysis that were transforming ecclesiastical justice from medieval, trial by ordeal, into something approaching modern criminal investigation. His mind operated with the precision of a clockmaker examining a mechanism whose surface perfection concealed internal irregularities that could only be detected through patient, systematic examination of every component and connection. But Francesco's intellectual capabilities were enhanced, rather than tempered, by genuine religious conviction that saw corruption within the Church as an assault on divine authority, requiring swift and merciless response. He was not a cynical manipulator using religious authority to advance personal interests, but a true believer whose faith in the righteousness of his mission made him immune to the forms of seduction, bribery, or intimidation that had compromised previous investigators. His dedication to exposing and punishing ecclesiastical corruption was absolute, uncomplicated by self-doubt or sympathy for those whose destruction he considered necessary for the purification of religious life. Francesco's assignment to investigate Santa Chiara reflected Savonarola's growing concern that the apparent success of religious reform in Florence's convents might be concealing forms of systematic resistance that required more sophisticated detection methods than routine inspections could provide. Reports from other religious houses had revealed elaborate networks of deception that had operated for years without detection by local authorities, suggesting that enclosed women possessed both the intelligence and the determination to maintain forbidden activities despite official surveillance and punishment. The very success that Santa Chiara demonstrated in adapting to reformed religious discipline made it suspect as a potential center of hidden resistance that demanded investigation by someone with the skills and authority to uncover whatever deceptions might exist beneath its exemplary surface. The methodology that Francesco brought to his investigation reflected the latest developments in ecclesiastical law enforcement, techniques that emphasize pattern recognition over reliance on obvious evidence, systematic analysis over intuitive judgment. Instead of seeking dramatic instances of transgression that could be detected through casual observation, he focused on identifying subtle inconsistencies in behavior, schedule, and resource allocation that might indicate organized deception designed to avoid conventional detection methods. His first weeks at Santa Chiara were spent in careful observation that appeared routine to those being watched, but actually involved sophisticated analysis of temporal patterns, social relationships, and material circumstances that could reveal hidden activities. Francesco noted which nuns always maintained consistent schedules and which showed unexplained variations in their daily routines. He catalogued the frequency and duration of interactions between different sisters, looking for relationships that suggested inappropriate intimacy or shared secrets. Most importantly, he conducted detailed examination of the convent's financial records, architectural layout, and material inventory to identify discrepancies that might indicate resources being diverted to unauthorized purposes. This systematic approach represented a quantum advancement over previous investigative methods that had relied primarily on reports from informants or accidental discovery of obvious transgressions. Francesco understood that the most dangerous deceptions were precisely those that operated entirely within officially approved frameworks, that used legitimate activities as cover for illegitimate purposes, that created parallel structures of authority and resource allocation that remained invisible to conventional oversight while serving purposes that directly contradicted institutional objectives. The first anomaly that attracted his attention was subtle but significant: variations in the consumption of materials and supplies that suggested usage patterns inconsistent with the activities that supposedly accounted for their requisition. Candles, lamp oil, writing materials, and food supplies were disappearing at rates that exceeded what the documented activities of the religious community should have required, indicating either systematic waste, unauthorized distribution, or consumption by activities that were not included in official records. More intriguingly, his examination of the convent's architectural layout revealed inconsistencies between the building's external dimensions and the internal spaces that could be accounted for by documented rooms and corridors. The measurements suggested either significant structural waste in the original construction, which seemed unlikely given medieval builders' concern for efficiency, or the existence of concealed spaces that were not included in current floor plans but continued to consume resources for heating, lighting, and maintenance. But the most suspicious pattern Francesco identified involved the scheduling and behaviour of Sister Caterina herself, whose reputation for exceptional religious devotion and intellectual capability made her both a model for other nuns and a potential focus for investigating how such exemplary behaviour might be used as cover for activities that violated the principles it appeared to embody. Her requests for additional private prayer time, extended consultations with various male authorities who served the convent, and involvement in projects that required access to materials and spaces beyond normal religious requirements created opportunities for activities that could not be verified through conventional oversight methods. Francesco's analysis of Caterina's interactions with the various men who served Santa Chiara in official capacities revealed patterns that suggested relationships extending beyond their documented professional purposes. The frequency and duration of her conferences with Father Lorenzo, the complexity of her collaborations with manuscript clients like Giuliano Vespucci, her extensive consultations with Count Filippo regarding spiritual matters, her involvement with construction projects supervised by Marco Benedetti, and her ongoing medical treatments from Alessandro Tornabuoni created a network of male contacts that provided numerous opportunities for inappropriate relationships while maintaining the appearance of legitimate religious and professional activities. But Francesco's most significant discovery came through patient observation of temporal patterns that revealed systematic coordination between activities that should have been independent of each other. The scheduling of construction work, medical consultations, artistic commissions, and spiritual conferences showed subtle but consistent relationships that suggested deliberate orchestration rather than mere coincidence. Someone was managing these various activities as components of a larger system that served purposes beyond their individual professional objectives. This recognition transformed Francesco's investigation from routine inspection for obvious violations into systematic analysis of what appeared to be an elaborate conspiracy involving multiple participants in organized deception designed to circumvent religious authority while maintaining the appearance of exemplary compliance with reformed discipline. The scale and sophistication of what he was discovering exceeded anything in his previous experience of ecclesiastical corruption, suggesting intelligence and organizational capability that challenged basic assumptions about the capacity of enclosed women to mount serious resistance to institutional control. The response to this discovery reflected both Francesco's investigative training and his genuine religious conviction. Instead of immediately confronting the suspected participants with accusations that could lead to denial, destruction of evidence, or flight by accomplices, he intensified his covert surveillance while beginning to develop the kind of comprehensive case that would make successful prosecution inevitable once formal charges were brought. His experience had taught him that complex conspiracies could only be definitively exposed through patient accumulation of evidence that documented not just individual transgressions but systematic patterns of organized resistance to religious authority. But Francesco's investigation also revealed the extraordinary sophistication of the deception he was attempting to uncover. The network of relationships and activities that centered on Sister Caterina had been constructed with intelligence and attention to detail that anticipated and countered conventional detection methods. Every relationship maintained plausible professional justification. Every activity had legitimate religious or practical purposes that could explain its existence to casual investigation. Every resource allocation could be attributed to documented needs that appeared entirely appropriate for a well-managed religious institution. The challenge for Francesco was developing evidence that could prove systematic deception, despite the careful construction of alternative explanations for every suspicious element he had identified. The very sophistication of what he was investigating made conventional proof difficult to obtain, while the intelligence demonstrated by its construction suggested that confronting any individual participant might trigger responses that could destroy evidence and protect other members of what was clearly a carefully coordinated conspiracy. This recognition led Francesco to modify his investigative strategy in ways that reflected both his respect for the intelligence of his opponents and his determination to expose whatever systematic corruption existed within Santa Chiara, regardless of the sophistication of its concealment. Instead of relying on direct confrontation or attempts to obtain confessions through intimidation, he began to implement more subtle methods designed to create pressure and opportunities for mistakes that would provide the definitive evidence required for successful prosecution. The psychological pressure created by Francesco's presence at Santa Chiara was immediate and devastating for everyone involved in the network of secret relationships that had developed around Caterina. His reputation for methodical investigation and successful prosecution of ecclesiastical corruption was well known throughout Florence's religious community, and his assignment to Santa Chiara could only mean that serious suspicions had been raised about activities that had previously escaped official attention. For Caterina herself, Francesco's arrival represented the most serious threat she had faced since beginning her rebellion against religious authority 3 years earlier. Unlike the local clergy who had conducted previous inspections, Francesco possessed both the intelligence and the authority to uncover systematic deception, regardless of how carefully it had been concealed. His investigative methodology was specifically designed to detect the kinds of sophisticated resistance that she had been implementing, while his religious conviction made him immune to the psychological manipulation that had proven effective with other male authorities. The realization that she was facing someone whose capabilities matched or exceeded her own forced Caterina to confront the possibility that everything she had built might be discovered and destroyed, despite her careful planning and meticulous execution. The system of relationships and activities that had provided unprecedented freedom and satisfaction within the constraints of religious life was suddenly revealed as potentially fatal vulnerability that could result in death for everyone involved if Francesco's investigation succeeded in documenting the evidence he was clearly seeking. But even as the walls began closing in around her elaborate deception, Caterina understood that survival would require not panicked flight or desperate concealment, but the same intelligence and strategic thinking that had made her success possible in the first place. Francesco represented a more sophisticated opponent than any she had previously encountered, but he was still operating within assumptions and limitations that could potentially be exploited by someone who understood his psychology and methodology as thoroughly as she had learned to understand those of her various lovers. This battle between systematic investigation and systematic deception that was beginning at Santa Chiara would test not just Caterina's ability to protect what she had built, but her capacity to outmaneuver an opponent whose intelligence and dedication matched her own, while operating from a position of institutional authority that gave him advantages she had never been forced to overcome. The clockwork precision that had made her network of relationships possible was about to face the most rigorous examination it had ever encountered from someone whose life's work involved dismantling exactly the kinds of complex deceptions that she had spent years perfecting. Chapter 12. The Jealous God. The first crack in the carefully maintained facade appeared not through Francesco's systematic investigation, but through the volcanic eruption of masculine possessiveness that Caterina had been managing with increasing difficulty since Count Filippo Orsini's initial involvement in her network of secret relationships. By October, his aristocratic entitlement and natural jealousy had been inflamed to dangerous levels by subtle signs that his supposedly exclusive access to Sister Caterina's affections was not as complete as he had been led to believe. The very success of her deception in maintaining multiple relationships while convincing each participant of his unique status was beginning to generate suspicions and resentments that threatened to expose everything through the destructive power of wounded masculine pride. Count Filippo's growing paranoia had been triggered by accumulating evidence that someone else was also receiving intimate attention from the woman he considered his private conquest within the supposedly inviolate walls of Santa Chiara. His sharp political instincts, honed by decades of navigating Florentine court intrigue and commercial competition, had begun to detect inconsistencies in Caterina's behaviour that suggested emotional and physical investments that could not be accounted for by their relationship alone. Her knowledge of contemporary events that she should not have possessed, her familiarity with cultural developments that exceeded what their conversations could have provided, her occasional references to ideas and information that seemed to come from sources other than their supposedly exclusive intellectual partnership, all combined to create suspicions that her claims of complete devotion were concealing relationships that diminished his special status. But what transformed suspicion into active investigation was Count Filippo's recognition that his psychological domination of Sister Caterina was less complete than he had believed. The woman who had initially appeared to submit to his authority through grateful recognition of his superior social position and protective power was revealing subtle signs of independence and self-direction that suggested she possessed resources and relationships beyond his knowledge or control. Her confident handling of complex theological and philosophical questions, her sophisticated understanding of political developments, her evident familiarity with artistic and cultural matters that their conversations had barely touched, all indicated intellectual stimulation and emotional support that she was obtaining from sources that remained mysterious despite his increasingly direct inquiries about how she spent her time when not meeting with him. This realization struck at the core of Count Filippo's identity as someone whose wealth and social position guaranteed him exclusive access to whatever he desired, including the complete submission of women whose circumstances made resistance to his authority both impossible and futile. The possibility that Sister Caterina was maintaining other relationships that provided satisfaction he could not supply represented not just romantic disappointment, but fundamental challenge to his understanding of his own power and desirability. If a supposedly enclosed nun could successfully deceive him about the nature and extent of her attachments, then his mastery over the world around him was less complete than he had always assumed. The investigation that Count Filippo launched into Sister Caterina's activities demonstrated both the resources available to someone of his social position and the dangerous unpredictability that came from combining aristocratic arrogance with genuine intelligence and unlimited financial means. Unlike Francesco's systematic ecclesiastical investigation, which operated within institutional frameworks and legal procedures that made its methods predictable, Count Filippo's private inquiry was constrained only by his imagination and his willingness to spend whatever was necessary to obtain the information he sought. His first approach involved direct intimidation of the servants, artisans, and minor clergy who moved through Santa Chiara in various professional capacities, offering substantial bribes for information about unusual activities within the convent, while threatening severe consequences for anyone who might be concealing knowledge of inappropriate relationships or secret communications. This crude but effective method quickly revealed that several men had been maintaining regular contact with Sister Caterina under circumstances that suggested purposes beyond their official duties, though the specific nature of these relationships remained unclear due to the discretion and loyalty of those involved. More sophisticated surveillance involved hiring professional investigators whose services were available to wealthy Florentines who needed information about commercial rivals, political opponents, or personal enemies. These men possessed skills in covert observation and evidence gathering that complemented Count Filippo's social authority with technical expertise in detecting and documenting activities that were designed to avoid official notice. Their assignment was to identify everyone who entered Santa Chiara for any purpose, to monitor the duration and apparent nature of all interactions with Sister Caterina, and to discover any patterns or relationships that might explain the inconsistencies in her behaviour that had aroused his suspicions. But the most dangerous aspect of Count Filippo's investigation was his willingness to use his political influence and social connections to pressure other participants in what he was beginning to understand was a complex network of deception that had made him look foolish while compromising his exclusive claim to relationship with someone he considered his property. His threats to withdraw patronage from Santa Chiara, unless Mother Superior provided complete information about Sister Caterina's activities, created administrative pressure that could force disclosure of information that had previously remained protected by religious confidentiality and institutional loyalty. More immediately threatening was his direct confrontation with the men whom his investigation had identified as maintaining suspicious relationships with Sister Caterina despite their supposedly professional purposes for being at Santa Chiara. Count Filippo's social position gave him authority to demand explanations from Father Lorenzo about the unusual frequency and duration of his confessional sessions, to question Giuliano Vespucci about manuscript consultations that seemed to require more private meetings than comparable projects, to challenge Marco Benedetti about construction work that provided opportunities for extensive private conversation with religious women who should have been maintaining appropriate distance from secular men. These confrontations were conducted with the casual brutality that characterized aristocratic exercise of social dominance, combining implied threats about future professional prospects with direct questions about activities that could not be answered honestly, without admitting to systematic violation of religious and social boundaries. The men who found themselves subjected to Count Filippo's interrogation understood that their livelihoods and possibly their lives depended on providing explanations that satisfied his suspicions, while protecting both themselves and the woman whose relationships with them had created the crisis they were now facing. But Count Filippo's investigation also revealed to him the extraordinary sophistication of the deception that had been practiced against him for months. The evidence he uncovered suggested not just casual transgression or opportunistic corruption, but systematic organization of multiple relationships that had been coordinated with precision that indicated planning and intelligence far beyond anything he had previously attributed to enclosed religious women. The realization that he had been outmaneuvered by someone he had considered intellectually and socially inferior created rage that demanded satisfaction regardless of the consequences for anyone involved. The psychological dynamics driving Count Filippo's increasingly dangerous behavior reflected the particular form of masculine entitlement that considered any resistance to aristocratic authority as intolerable challenge requiring swift and merciless response. His wealth and social position had accustomed him to immediate satisfaction of his desires and complete submission from those whose circumstances made defiance impossible. The discovery that Sister Caterina had successfully manipulated his emotions and exploited his resources while maintaining relationships that diminished his exclusive status represented not just personal betrayal, but assault on the natural order that placed men like him in positions of unquestionable authority over women whose lives they controlled. But Count Filippo's rage was complicated by genuine attraction to Sister Caterina that made simple punishment or abandonment emotionally unsatisfying despite his fury at her deception. His appreciation for her intelligence and beauty had been authentic even if his understanding of her character had been completely inaccurate, and his investment in their relationship had gone beyond mere sexual conquest to include emotional attachment that could not be easily dismissed despite his anger at discovering its fraudulent foundations. This created a volatile situation where Count Filippo's desire for revenge against those who had made him look foolish was competing with his continuing attraction to the woman whose deception had demonstrated capabilities that made her even more fascinating than he had previously realized. The combination of rage and desire generated unpredictable responses that swung between threats of complete destruction and offers of protection that would require eliminating everyone else involved in relationships that challenged his exclusive claim to her affections. The crisis reached its peak during a confrontation between Count Filippo and Sister Caterina that took place in one of the concealed chambers that his investigation had finally succeeded in discovering through systematic pressure applied to Marco Benedetti, whose construction knowledge and emotional vulnerability had made him the weakest link in the network of men who had been protecting the secret of the hidden spaces within Santa Chiara. The meeting represented the first time that Count Filippo had been forced to acknowledge explicitly that his supposedly unique relationship was actually one element in a complex system of deception that had operated successfully for years, while making him appear ridiculous to anyone who possessed complete information about Sister Caterina's actual activities. But the confrontation also demonstrated Caterina's sophisticated understanding of masculine psychology that had made her successful in managing multiple relationships despite their inherent contradictions and dangers. Instead of attempting denial or offering apologies that would have confirmed Count Filippo's sense of betrayal while failing to satisfy his need for explanation, she acknowledged the intelligence and persistence that had enabled him to uncover deceptions that had fooled everyone else, praised his superior capabilities that had made concealment ultimately impossible, and expressed genuine admiration for qualities that distinguished him from the other men whose relationships with her had been exposed by his investigation. This response appealed to Count Filippo's ego while repositioning their relationship from simple deception to complex game, where her intelligence had been tested against his and found wanting, where his ultimate victory demonstrated superiority that made their relationship more rather than less valuable, despite the temporary setbacks created by her attempts at independent action. By framing the discovery of her other relationships as evidence of his exceptional, rather than ordinary masculine authority, Caterina transformed what could have been fatal exposure into confirmation of special status that satisfied his psychological needs, while creating possibilities for negotiating solutions that might preserve some elements of what she had built. But Count Filippo's investigation had also attracted the attention of Brother Francesco, whose systematic inquiry into possible corruption at Santa Chiara now had access to evidence that confirmed his suspicions about organized deception involving multiple participants in activities that clearly violated both religious law and secular authority. The aristocratic resources and social connections that Count Filippo had used to uncover Sister Caterina's network of relationships had also made those relationships visible to ecclesiastical investigation that possessed both the authority and the determination to pursue complete exposure and punishment of everyone involved. The collision between Count Filippo's private investigation and Francesco's official inquiry created a situation where the various forms of masculine authority that had previously operated independently were now competing for control over the same information and the same woman, each driven by different motivations but all committed to outcomes that would require destruction of the carefully balanced system that had provided unprecedented freedom within the constraints of enclosed religious life. The irony was that Count Filippo's jealousy, which had been the greatest threat to the security of Caterina's network of secret relationships, was also becoming her most valuable asset in the struggle against Francesco's systematic investigation. The aristocratic pride and possessive fury that had made Count Filippo dangerous to her other lovers also made him resistant to ecclesiastical authority that threatened to destroy someone he considered his personal property, regardless of her transgressions against religious law. But managing this volatile situation required psychological sophistication and strategic thinking that exceeded anything Caterina had previously attempted, as she found herself caught between masculine authorities whose conflicting interests could be exploited only by someone who understood their different psychologies while possessing the intelligence and courage to play them against each other despite the mortal risks involved for everyone concerned. The game that had begun as systematic rebellion against religious authority through carefully managed relationships with individual men was now evolving into complex political struggle involving institutional power, aristocratic privilege, and ecclesiastical justice, where the stakes had escalated from personal freedom to physical survival for all participants in what had become the most elaborate deception in the history of Renaissance Florence. Chapter 13. The Walls Have Voices. The October morning, when Sister Benedetta de Cecco made her discovery, dawned grey and cold, with frost covering the convent windows like accusations written in ice. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a minor Florentine merchant family whose modest wealth had been sufficient to secure her placement at Santa Chiara, but not to provide the kind of substantial dowry that would have made marriage within her social class possible. Unlike Caterina, whose entrance into religious life had been driven by family financial crisis, Benedetta had come to the convent through genuine religious calling, possessed of the kind of simple faith that saw in enclosed life an opportunity for pure devotion to divine service, rather than merely an alternative to secular disappointment. But what made Benedetta truly dangerous to the elaborate deception that now characterized every aspect of life at Santa Chiara was not her religious devotion alone, but the combination of innocent trust and intelligent observation that led her to notice inconsistencies while interpreting them through frameworks of assumption that made the truth more rather than less shocking when she finally encountered it. She had spent the 18 months since her arrival looking up to Sister Caterina as a model of successful religious life, someone whose apparent combination of intellectual sophistication and spiritual dedication represented everything that she hoped to achieve through her own commitment to conventual existence. Benedetta's admiration for Caterina had been based on careful observation of behavior that seemed to demonstrate perfect integration of learning and piety, worldly knowledge and religious wisdom, practical capability and spiritual insight. The older nun's reputation for theological sophistication had made her conversations precious to someone who hungered for intellectual companionship within the restricted environment of religious enclosure, while her apparent success in maintaining serenity despite the harsh disciplines imposed by Mother Superior Suor Margherita had provided inspiration during moments when the physical and psychological demands of reformed religious life seemed overwhelming. But Benedetta's genuine devotion to religious ideals had also made her sensitive to subtle inconsistencies in the spiritual atmosphere of Santa Chiara that suggested some form of corruption or compromise was affecting the community's ability to achieve the purified religious life that Savonarolan reform was supposed to create. The convent that should have radiated peace and spiritual joy often felt tense and secretive, filled with undercurrents of anxiety and excitement that seemed incompatible with the detachment from worldly concerns that enclosed religious women were supposed to cultivate. More specifically, she had begun to notice that Sister Caterina's exemplary religious behaviour was accompanied by signs of satisfaction and confidence that seemed to exceed what could be attributed to purely spiritual sources. The woman who claimed to find complete fulfillment in prayer and religious study displayed knowledge of contemporary events, familiarity with cultural developments, and emotional vitality that suggested experiences beyond what the official routine of conventual life could provide. Her conversations revealed intellectual stimulation, her demeanour suggested emotional satisfaction, and her physical appearance showed levels of health and vitality that contrasted sharply with the deliberate austerity that characterised most aspects of reformed religious discipline. The discovery that would destroy everything began with Benedetta's search for a private place where she could pray without interruption during the periods of free time that Mother Superior reluctantly allowed between the mandatory religious exercises that filled most of each day. The official chapel was often occupied by other sisters, the individual cells were too small for extended kneeling, and the common areas provided no opportunity for the kind of intimate communion with divine presence that she sought as remedy for the loneliness and doubt that sometimes threatened her commitment to religious life. Her exploration of Santa Chiara's less frequently used spaces led her to areas of the building where medieval architecture created small chambers and alcoves that were not included in the current allocation of space for religious purposes. These forgotten corners often provided the solitude she needed for private devotion, and she had developed the habit of discovering new locations when her regular prayer spots became too familiar to support the sense of special communion with divine presence that made extended meditation genuinely satisfying rather than merely dutiful. On the morning that would prove fatal to Caterina's elaborate deception, Benedetta was seeking such a space in a section of the building where recent construction work had left some areas temporarily unused while repairs were completed. Her search led her to examine what appeared to be a storage chamber behind one of the main corridors, a space that seemed perfect for private prayer, due to its separation from the normal traffic patterns that characterized daily life at Santa Chiara. But when she attempted to enter what she had assumed was a simple storage room, Benedetta discovered that the chamber was already occupied, furnished with comfortable seating, well stocked with books and writing materials, and obviously in regular use by someone whose presence there was unauthorized and concealed from official supervision. The space was too comfortable and too carefully arranged to be merely a hiding place for occasional solitude, too well equipped with expensive materials and furnishings to be explained by normal religious purposes, too systematically concealed to be anything other than deliberately secret rather than merely private. The books alone would have been sufficient to create suspicion and concern. The collection included not just religious texts that might be appropriate for private study, but works of classical literature, contemporary philosophy, and humanist scholarship that were far beyond what enclosed nuns were supposed to possess or study. More troubling were the personal letters, expensive gifts, and luxury items that spoke of relationships and activities that directly contradicted the principles of religious poverty and separation from worldly concerns that were supposed to govern every aspect of conventual life. But what made the discovery truly devastating was the evidence it provided of systematic deception involving multiple participants in organized transgression against religious authority. The chamber contained materials that clearly belonged to different men whose official business at Santa Chiara should not have required private meeting spaces or extended secret communications. The correspondence revealed relationships that went far beyond appropriate professional interactions, while the luxury items and expensive furnishings indicated resources and generosity that could only be explained by personal rather than official motivations for maintaining contact with someone who was supposed to be completely separated from secular relationships and material concerns. Most shocking of all was the realization that the chamber was not an isolated transgression, but part of a larger network of concealed spaces that had been developed throughout Santa Chiara, with sophisticated engineering and substantial investment of time and resources. The passages and connections that Benedetta discovered through systematic, exploration revealed a parallel architecture that existed entirely outside official knowledge or supervision, creating possibilities for movement and activity that made comprehensive deception not just possible but systematically sustainable over extended periods. The psychological impact of these discoveries on someone of Benedetta's temperament and background was catastrophic in ways that went far beyond mere shock at encountering evidence of rule-breaking or corruption. Her genuine religious faith had been based on trust in the integrity of the institutional structures that were supposed to support and guide spiritual development, confidence that the authorities who governed religious life were committed to the same ideals of purity and devotion that she had embraced in then entering conventual existence. The evidence she had discovered revealed not just individual transgression, but systematic corruption that challenged the fundamental assumptions about religious life that had motivated her own commitment to enclosed existence. If someone like Sister Caterina, whose reputation for exemplary religious behaviour had made her a model for other nuns, was actually maintaining elaborate networks of secular relationships while performing perfect compliance with reform discipline, then nothing about the apparent spiritual success of Santa Chiara could be trusted as authentic rather than merely theatrical. But what made Benedetta's discovery particularly dangerous was the way her innocent faith interpreted the evidence she had found. Someone with more worldly experience might have recognized the sophisticated intelligence and strategic thinking that had made such elaborate deception possible, might have appreciated the remarkable achievement that systematic rebellion against religious authority represented under circumstances that should have made any significant autonomy impossible. Instead, Benedetta saw only corruption and betrayal that demanded immediate correction through proper religious channels, regardless of the consequences for those involved. Her genuine devotion to spiritual ideals made compromise or accommodation impossible when faced with evidence of activities that directly contradicted everything she believed religious life was supposed to represent. The sophistication and success of what she had discovered made it more rather than less threatening to her understanding of religious authenticity and institutional integrity. The crisis reached its climax when Benedetta's anguished conscience drove her to seek guidance from Mother Superior Suor Margherita about the terrible discoveries she had made during what she had intended as innocent search for a private prayer space. The confession took place in the Mother Superior's private chamber, the same room where the architectural drawings that had made Caterina's rebellion possible were still hidden in the wooden chest that had remained undisturbed for decades. Benedetta's report was delivered with the trembling voice and tear-filled eyes of someone whose faith in the goodness of religious authority had been shattered by encountering evidence of corruption that exceeded her worst fears about human weakness and institutional failure. She described the hidden chambers, the evidence of multiple relationships, the luxury items and expensive furnishings that spoke of systematic violation of religious vows and principles. But she also conveyed her bewilderment at discovering that the woman she had most admired for spiritual achievement was actually the architect of elaborate deception that made mockery of everything that religious life was supposed to represent. Mother Superior's response demonstrated both her administrative competence and her recognition that the situation Benedetta had uncovered threatened not just individual careers, but the institutional survival of Santa Chiara itself. The evidence of systematic corruption involving multiple participants in organized transgression against religious authority was precisely the kind of scandal that could trigger investigations, prosecutions, and punishments that would destroy the convent's reputation and eliminate its ability to function as a respectable religious institution. But Suor Margherita's handling of the crisis also revealed her sophisticated understanding of ecclesiastical politics, and her recognition that the timing of Benedetta's discovery created opportunities as well as dangers for those who possessed complete information about what had been happening at Santa Chiara. Brother Francesco's ongoing investigation had already created the suspicions about possible corruption within the convent, and providing him with definitive evidence of systematic deception could demonstrate institutional cooperation with reform efforts, while deflecting blame from administrators who could claim ignorance of activities that had been concealed through extraordinary sophisticated methods. The immediate result of Benedetta's confession was the systematic investigation of the concealed spaces that she had discovered, an exploration that revealed the full extent of the parallel architecture and secret activities that had been developing within Santa Chiara for years without detection by official oversight. The chambers and passages that Marco had constructed, the luxury furnishings that Count Filippo had provided, the books and materials that Giuliano had supplied, The artistic objects that Pietro had created, the medical supplies that Alessandro had contributed, all were catalogued as evidence of conspiracy and corruption that would support charges against everyone involved. But the most devastating discovery was not material evidence alone, but the correspondence and personal items that documented the emotional and intellectual relationships that had motivated and sustained the systematic transgression against religious authority. The letters revealed not just physical transgression, but genuine affection, intellectual partnership, and emotional satisfaction that challenged official assumptions about the capacity of religious discipline to suppress human needs for companionship, stimulation, and authentic personal connection. This evidence transformed what could have been dismissed as mere violation of religious rules into something far more threatening to ecclesiastical authority, proof that intelligent and determined women could create alternative forms of community and relationship that provided satisfaction and fulfillment despite systematic attempts to eliminate all sources of joy and companionship outside approved religious channels. The exposure of Caterina's network of secret relationships marked the end of the most sophisticated rebellion against religious authority in Renaissance history, but it also represented the beginning of consequences that would extend far beyond individual punishment to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of religious life and the possibility of maintaining authentic human dignity within institutional structures designed to eliminate personal autonomy and individual freedom. As Mother Superior prepared to summon Brother Francesco to examine the evidence that Benedetta's innocent faith had uncovered, the bells of Santa Chiara rang sext, calling the sisters to midday prayer with the same mechanical precision that had marked the temporal choreography of forbidden relationships for years. But the clockwork that had sustained elaborate deception through perfect timing and systematic coordination was finally running down, its mainspring broken by the collision between calculated sophistication and genuine religious devotion that could not tolerate the gap between appearance and reality when human souls were at stake. The young woman who had sought only private space for authentic communion with divine presence had instead discovered evidence that would destroy lives, end careers, and transform Santa Chiara from a stage for successful rebellion into a monument to the inevitable failure of any attempt to achieve genuine freedom within systems designed to prevent its existence. Her innocent eyes had seen through deceptions that had fooled the most sophisticated observers, proving that sometimes the greatest threat to elaborate conspiracies comes not from intelligent opposition, but from simple honesty that refuses to accept that things are not what they appear to be. Chapter 14. The Mercy of Stones. The ecclesiastical tribunal that convened in the chapter house of Santa Chiara on a bitter November morning operated with the mechanical efficiency of a judicial system that had perfected the art of destroying lives through legal procedure over centuries of practice. Brother Francesco presided over proceedings that combined elements of criminal prosecution, heresy trial, and political theatre in ways designed to satisfy multiple objectives simultaneously, punishing transgression, deterring future rebellion, and demonstrating the power of religious authority to penetrate even the most sophisticated deceptions and exact appropriate retribution from those who dared to challenge institutional control. The formal charges read against Sister Caterina encompassed not just violation of religious vows, but systematic conspiracy to subvert ecclesiastical authority through organized deception, involving multiple participants in activities that constituted both spiritual corruption and civil criminal behavior. But beneath the legal language lay accusations that struck at fundamental assumptions about the nature of religious life and the possibility of maintaining authentic spiritual community when human needs for companionship, intellectual stimulation, and emotional satisfaction were systematically denied rather than properly channeled through approved religious exercises. The evidence presented during 3 days of testimony created a comprehensive picture of rebellion that exceeded anything previously documented in the history of Florentine religious institutions. The hidden chambers, the network of secret relationships, the elaborate systems of communication and resource allocation, the sophisticated coordination of schedules and activities all demonstrated intelligence and organizational capability that challenged official assumptions about the intellectual capacity of enclosed women and their ability to mount serious resistance to masculine authority when circumstances made direct confrontation impossible. But the tribunal was concerned with more than mere documentation of transgression. The legal proceedings served as public theatre designed to reinforce social and religious hierarchies through ritualized demonstration of the consequences that awaited those who attempted to subvert established order, regardless of the sophistication of their methods or the apparent success of their resistance. Every aspect of the trial was choreographed to emphasize the ultimate powerlessness of individual intelligence and determination when confronted with institutional authority backed by divine sanction and secular power. The men whose relationships with Sister Caterina had been exposed through the investigation faced different forms of justice that reflected their varying social positions and degrees of complicity in activities that the tribunal characterized as systematic corruption of religious discipline. Father Lorenzo Benedetti's case was handled through ecclesiastical channels that emphasized his violation of clerical vows and abuse of pastoral authority in conducting inappropriate relationships with women under his spiritual guidance. His punishment, defrocking public penance and exile from Florence, represented complete destruction of his career and social position, while serving as warning to other clergy about the consequences of allowing personal desires to override professional responsibilities. Giuliano Vespucci's merchant family possessed sufficient wealth and political connections to negotiate arrangements that protected him from the most severe consequences, while requiring substantial financial penalties and public humiliation that would damage but not destroy his commercial prospects. His case was treated as evidence of how secular corruption could penetrate religious institutions through commercial relationships that appeared legitimate, but actually served purposes that violated both religious law and social propriety. The substantial fine imposed on his family served multiple purposes, compensating the Church for damages caused by his transgression, while demonstrating that wealth could not purchase complete immunity from consequences when religious authority had been violated. Count Filippo Orsini presented the most complex case because his aristocratic position and political influence made direct prosecution problematic, while his role in both facilitating and ultimately exposing the network of deceptions required careful handling to avoid creating precedents that might encourage other nobles to believe they could challenge ecclesiastical authority without facing appropriate consequences. The solution developed through negotiations between religious and secular authorities emphasized his cooperation in the investigation, while requiring private penance and substantial donations to religious institutions that would serve as both punishment and demonstration of renewed commitment to supporting rather than corrupting religious discipline. Marco Benedetti faced the harshest secular punishment because his working-class background provided no protection from the full force of legal retribution, while his technical skills in creating the concealed spaces made him appear particularly dangerous as someone whose abilities could be employed by others seeking to subvert religious or civil authority. His execution by burning served multiple symbolic purposes, eliminating someone whose knowledge threatened institutional security, while demonstrating that practical intelligence could not protect those who lack social position from the ultimate consequences of challenging established power structures. Alessandro Tornabuoni's medical training and professional standing provided some protection from the most extreme punishments, but his case was handled through mechanisms that emphasized the violation of trust involved when someone with legitimate authority used professional access to pursue personal relationships that corrupted the very institutions he was supposed to serve. His exile from Florence and prohibition from practicing medicine represented destruction of his career, while serving as warning to other professionals about the consequences of exploiting professional relationships for purposes that violated both professional ethics and religious law. Pietro Salvatore's artistic temperament and romantic idealism made him particularly vulnerable to the psychological pressures of interrogation and legal proceedings that emphasized the criminal nature of activities he had understood as expressions of love and creative collaboration. Unable to reconcile his aesthetic philosophy with the brutal reality of legal consequences that reduced transcendent artistic and romantic partnership to mere criminal conspiracy, he chose suicide rather than face the public humiliation and professional destruction that conviction would have brought. His death served the tribunal's purposes as effectively as formal execution, while providing additional evidence of the moral corruption that inevitably accompanied systematic violation of religious discipline. But the centerpiece of the entire proceedings was the case against Sister Caterina herself, whose intelligence and strategic sophistication had made the entire network of deceptions possible while challenging fundamental assumptions about the capacity of religious discipline to control human behavior when applied to people who possessed exceptional intellectual capabilities and indomitable determination to claim authentic freedom despite institutional constraints designed to prevent its existence. The charges against her encompassed not just individual transgression, but systematic rebellion against religious authority that threatened the foundations of institutional control over women whose circumstances made them dependent on ecclesiastical protection and guidance. The evidence presented during her trial documented not just violation of specific rules, but comprehensive rejection of the principles that justified enclosing women in religious institutions as remedy for social problems created by economic circumstances that made conventional marriage and family life impossible for daughters whose families could not provide appropriate dowries. But what made Caterina's case particularly significant was her refusal to perform the repentance and submission that legal proceedings were designed to elicit from those whose transgression had been definitively proven through systematic investigation and comprehensive documentation. Instead of acknowledging guilt and requesting mercy through demonstration of renewed commitment to religious obedience, she used the opportunity provided by formal legal procedures to articulate a defense that constituted indictment of the entire system of assumptions and practices that justified maintaining women in conditions of enforced dependency and systematic denial of basic human needs for companionship, intellectual stimulation, and emotional satisfaction. Her final statement to the tribunal, delivered with calm dignity despite the certainty of condemnation and death, transformed legal proceedings from routine punishment of individual transgression into confrontation between different philosophies about the nature of human dignity and the legitimate purposes of religious authority. She spoke not as penitent seeking forgiveness, but as advocate for alternative understanding of spiritual life that recognized rather than denied the divine significance of human relationships, intellectual exploration, and creative expression. You condemn my relationships with men whose companionship enriched my understanding of divine love rather than diminishing it, she declared to judges whose authority she acknowledged while rejecting their moral right to determine the authenticity of her spiritual experience. You punish activities that brought joy and fulfillment, while preserving the fiction of religious devotion that you require but cannot create through systematic suppression of everything that makes human life worth living. You speak of corruption while ignoring the system that makes rebellion necessary for anyone who refuses to accept that religious life must be synonymous with spiritual and intellectual death. Her defense continued with systematic analysis of the economic and social circumstances that delivered women into religious institutions not through genuine spiritual calling but as solution to family financial problems that made conventional marriage impossible. She challenged the assumption that religious vows could transform unwilling captivity into authentic spiritual commitment, questioned whether institutions that operated through systematic denial of human needs could serve divine purposes that presumably involved the flourishing rather than the destruction of human capabilities and potential. If my intelligence and determination were gifts from the same divine source that you claim to serve, then using them to create relationships and experiences that honored rather than denied my humanity cannot be the spiritual failure you describe, but rather the spiritual success you fear to acknowledge. The system that requires the suppression of everything that makes life meaningful cannot be serving divine purposes regardless of the religious language used to justify its continuation. But perhaps most dangerously, her statement articulated principles that could inspire other women to question the legitimacy of institutional arrangements that required their submission to conditions that no one would consider acceptable if applied to people whose social position provided alternatives to religious enclosure. By refusing to accept guilt for creating authentic relationships and meaningful experiences within circumstances designed to prevent both, she challenged not just specific religious rules, but the entire framework of assumptions that justified maintaining women in conditions of systematic deprivation while characterizing their resistance as evidence of moral failure rather than institutional inadequacy. The tribunal's response to this defense demonstrated both the sophistication of ecclesiastical legal procedure and its ultimate reliance on physical force when intellectual arguments failed to produce the submission that institutional authority required. Unable to refute her analysis through theological or philosophical argument, the judges focused on the documentary evidence that proved systematic violation of religious law while characterizing her defense as additional evidence of spiritual pride and rebellious arrogance that made her particularly dangerous to the maintenance of proper religious discipline. The sentence of immurement, being walled up alive within the convent, represented the ultimate expression of institutional power over those who dared to challenge its authority through systematic resistance that could not be dismissed as mere individual weakness or temporary moral failure. The punishment was designed to serve multiple symbolic purposes simultaneously, eliminating someone whose continued existence would inspire other potential rebels, demonstrating the futility of intelligence and determination when confronted with absolute institutional power, and providing gruesome warning about the consequences of attempting to achieve authentic freedom within systems designed to prevent its existence. But the execution of the sentence also revealed the profound anxiety that Caterina's rebellion had created among those whose authority depended on maintaining assumptions about the natural inferiority and inevitable submission of women whose circumstances made resistance appear impossible. The elaborate legal proceedings, the comprehensive documentation of evidence, the carefully choreographed public ritual of condemnation and punishment, all reflected recognition that they had encountered something genuinely threatening to the intellectual and emotional foundations of their power, rather than mere criminal behaviour that could be handled through routine legal procedures. As the Masons built the wall that would entomb her alive, Caterina understood that her rebellion had succeeded in ways that extended far beyond the personal freedom and authentic relationships she had managed to create within the supposed prison of Santa Chiara. The very intensity of the institutional response to her systematic resistance proved that individual intelligence and determination could indeed challenge established power structures in ways that forced them to reveal their dependence on physical violence when intellectual and moral arguments failed to maintain the submission they required. The wall rose steadily as winter light faded from the narrow window that would be sealed last, cutting off her final connection to the world that had produced both the circumstances that made rebellion necessary and the intelligence that made it possible. But even as the stones closed around her, she maintained the dignified defiance that had characterized her entire campaign against religious authority, refusing to provide her executioners with the satisfaction of seeing fear or submission that would validate their assumptions about the inevitable failure of individual resistance to institutional power. The silence that would soon envelop her completely was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of someone who had achieved everything that circumstances made possible while maintaining the integrity and authenticity that institutional survival would have required her to abandon. In choosing to live fully despite the certain consequences rather than accepting partial life in exchange for security, she had demonstrated that human dignity was worth defending, even when defense meant death, that authentic existence was preferable to inauthentic survival regardless of the cost in suffering and loss. The bells of Santa Chiara that had marked the temporal choreography of her elaborate rebellion for years continued to ring the hours as they had before her arrival and would after her death. But they now marked time in a world where the possibility of systematic resistance to religious authority had been demonstrated even if it could not be sustained. The clockwork precision that had made her network of relationships possible was ending, but the memory of what one woman had achieved through intelligence, determination, an absolute refusal to accept that institutional convenience justified individual submission would survive as long as stones remained, to tell her story to anyone willing to listen to voices from the walls. Chapter 15. Voices from the Wall. The cell that would become Caterina's tomb measured 8 feet by 6 feet, with walls of rough-hewn stone that had been hastily constructed without the architectural elegance that characterized the rest of Santa Chiara. It contained only a wooden crucifix, a straw mattress that would provide minimal comfort during her final hours, and a small pitcher of water that represented the sole concession to human mercy in a punishment designed to demonstrate the absolute power of religious authority over those who dared to challenge its control through systematic resistance. But what the Masons who built her prison did not understand was that they were creating not just an execution chamber, but a scriptorium where the most important document in the history of Renaissance Florence would be carved into stone by hands that refused to accept silence as the price of their owner's destruction. The implements that Caterina had concealed in her clothing during the final journey to her place of execution were simple but sufficient for the task she had planned during the long nights when she understood that discovery and death were inevitable consequences of the rebellion she had chosen to pursue despite their certainty. A small chisel taken from Pietro's workshop, a nail file that had served her well in discovering the hidden passages that made her network of relationships possible, a shard of metal from one of Alessandro's medical instruments, tools that could transform the stone walls of her tomb into permanent record of everything that institutional authority was determined to erase from official memory. But Caterina's final project was more ambitious than mere personal testimony about her own experiences with the walls of Santa Chiara. As the Masons worked steadily to seal her into the space that would contain her until death by starvation and suffocation finally ended her resistance to religious authority, she understood that her last act of rebellion must serve purposes that extended far beyond individual vindication to challenge the entire framework of assumptions that justified maintaining women in conditions of systematic oppression, while characterizing their resistance as evidence of moral failure rather than institutional inadequacy. The text she carved into the stone began not with personal narrative, but with systematic analysis of the economic and social circumstances that delivered daughters into religious institutions as solution to family financial problems that made conventional marriage impossible. Her words documented not just her own case, but the broader pattern of using religious enclosure to dispose of women whose circumstances made them inconvenient to families that could not afford their maintenance in secular society, while lacking the resources needed to arrange appropriate marriages within their social class. In the year of our Lord 1498, she carved with careful precision, despite the failing light that filtered through the window that would soon be sealed forever. Alessandra Strozzi died, and Sister Caterina was born not through divine calling, but through economic necessity that transforms spiritual vocation into commercial transaction. Let those who read these words understand that religious life for women serves purposes that have nothing to do with spiritual development, and everything to do with solving practical problems created by social arrangements that treat daughters as financial burdens to be disposed of through whatever means prove most economical for their families. But her analysis extended beyond individual circumstances to examine the institutional structures that made systematic deception both necessary and possible for women who refused to accept complete submission to conditions that denied basic human needs for companionship, intellectual stimulation, and emotional satisfaction. She documented not just her own network of relationships, but the architectural and administrative vulnerabilities that had enabled its creation and maintenance despite sophisticated surveillance systems designed to prevent exactly the kinds of resistance she had successfully implemented for years. The walls that were built to contain us also concealed the spaces where we could exist as complete human beings, rather than empty vessels for approved religious sentiment. She carved as the sound of masonry work grew closer and the available light continued to diminish. Every building constructed to serve institutional control contains possibilities for subversion that can be discovered by those who possess sufficient intelligence and determination to claim whatever freedom circumstances make possible. Physical barriers are only as effective as the imagination and courage of those they are designed to contain. Her documentation of the psychological and logistical methods that had made multiple simultaneous relationships possible provided detailed analysis of masculine vulnerabilities that could be exploited by women who understood that survival required becoming predator rather than prey in circumstances where direct confrontation was impossible. But she also recorded the emotional costs of maintaining strategic relationships that demanded constant performance of submission and gratitude, while concealing the intelligence and determination that made successful manipulation possible. Men who possess power over women's lives assume that their authority grants them understanding of feminine psychology, but their arrogance creates blindness that can be exploited by anyone who studies their weaknesses with the same systematic attention they apply to maintaining their dominance, she carved, as her hands grew numb from cold and exertion. They see what they expect to see rather than what actually exists, and their expectations can be shaped by those who understand that appearing to conform to masculine assumptions about feminine nature provides perfect camouflage for activities that would destroy them if discovered through honest observation rather than wishful thinking. But the most significant portion of her carved testimony addressed questions that extended far beyond individual rebellion to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of religious authority and its right to demand complete submission from those whose circumstances made resistance seem impossible. Her words articulated philosophical and theological arguments that transformed criminal transgression into spiritual exploration, systematic deception into authentic search for divine truth through human relationships that honored rather than denied the complexity and potential of human nature. If human love reflects divine love rather than contradicting it, then relationships that bring joy and fulfillment cannot be the spiritual failures that religious authority describes, but rather the spiritual successes it fears to acknowledge. The system that requires suppression of everything that makes life meaningful cannot be serving divine purposes regardless of the religious language used to justify its continuation. She carved, as the window above grew smaller and darker, with each course of stones that rose toward final closure. Her theological analysis continued with systematic examination of the gap between Christian ideals about human dignity and divine love, and the practical operation of religious institutions that seemed designed to deny, rather than foster authentic spiritual development through positive human experiences. She challenged the assumption that spiritual growth required systematic elimination of joy, questioning whether institutions that operated through deliberate infliction of suffering could serve divine purposes that presumably involved human flourishing rather than human destruction. Christ spoke of abundant life and perfect love, but those who claim to serve him create institutions that systematically eliminate abundance and criminalize love in favor of empty compliance with rules that serve institutional convenience rather than spiritual truth. The corruption they condemn in my relationships was actually authenticity they could not tolerate because it exposed the spiritual poverty of systems that mistake submission for devotion and suffering for sanctification. But perhaps most importantly, her final testament addressed the women who would come after her, who would face similar circumstances and similar choices between authentic rebellion and inauthentic survival within systems designed to prevent genuine human flourishing. Her words provided both practical guidance about methods that had proven successful in creating freedom within constraint, and philosophical framework for understanding resistance as spiritual obligation rather than moral failure when institutional arrangements contradicted basic principles of human dignity. To the daughters who will be sold into religious life because their families cannot afford their freedom, remember that intelligence is a weapon, that beauty is a tool, and that even the most complete systems of control contain vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who refuse to accept that their circumstances define the limits of their possibilities. She carved as her strength began to fail, and the sound of approaching completion grew unmistakable in the steady rhythm of masonry work that would soon end forever, her ability to communicate with the world beyond her stone prison. Her hands continued to work even as breathing became difficult, and the temperature dropped with the approach of winter night that would find her sealed completely within walls that would preserve her words long after her voice was silenced forever. The final sections of her testimony combined practical instructions about architectural exploration, psychological manipulation, and strategic relationship management, with broader reflections about the nature of human dignity and the obligation to resist systems that denied its fundamental importance, regardless of the personal costs involved. Authentic life requires authentic choices, and authentic choices require the courage to accept consequences that may include destruction rather than compromise, that guarantees survival through self-betrayal. She carved with failing hands as the last light faded from the window that was now only a narrow gap between rising stones. I chose to live fully rather than partially, to love authentically rather than appropriately, to use my intelligence in service of my own flourishing rather than others' convenience. Let my death serve as proof that such choices are possible even when they are fatal, that human dignity is worth defending even when defense means destruction. The final stone was mortared into place as dawn broke over Florence on the feast of St. Catherine of Alexandria, whose legendary wisdom and courageous resistance to masculine authority had made her an appropriate namesake for someone whose intelligence and determination had created the most sophisticated rebellion against religious oppression in Renaissance history. The silence that enveloped Santa Chiara as the Masons completed their work was not the silence of institutional victory, but the silence of a tomb that contained more dangerous ideas than any living voice could have articulated. Outro. In the autumn of 2019, 5 centuries after Sister Caterina scratched her final words into stone, Dr. Maria Rossi of the University of Florence led the archaeological team that discovered what media reports would describe as the most significant find in Renaissance women's history. The renovation of Santa Chiara had revealed not just the skeleton of a woman walled up alive, but a complete testimony carved into every available surface of her tomb. Thousands of words that provided unprecedented insight into the daily reality of women's lives in religious institutions and the sophisticated methods they developed to resist systematic oppression. The international scholarly community that gathered to study Caterina's testament recognized immediately that they were examining something far more significant than individual criminal confession or religious martyrdom. Her carved words provided the first comprehensive documentation of systematic resistance to religious authority by someone who possessed both the intelligence to develop effective methods of rebellion and the literary skill to articulate their broader implications for understanding the relationship between individual dignity and institutional control. Dr. Rossi, whose own research focused on women's agency in patriarchal societies, found herself profoundly moved by the discovery of a voice that spoke across centuries with undiminished clarity about issues that remained relevant to contemporary struggles for gender equality and individual autonomy. "Here is a woman who refused to disappear," she told the international press conference that announced the discovery. She understood that her individual resistance would fail, but she also understood that her words could survive to inspire others who face similar choices between authentic rebellion and inauthentic survival. The carved testimony that covered every surface of Caterina's tomb was photographed, transcribed and translated into dozens of languages as scholars around the world recognized its significance not just for Renaissance history, but for understanding the eternal human struggle between individual authenticity and institutional control. Universities developed entire courses around her writings. Feminist scholars analyzed her psychological insights, historians marveled at her, documentation of medieval architectural techniques, and theologians debated her challenges to traditional religious authority. But perhaps the most powerful response came from contemporary women who found in Caterina's words validation for their own struggles against systems that demanded submission in exchange for security, that characterized resistance as selfishness and authentic choice as moral failure. Her carved testament became a manifesto for anyone who had ever been forced to choose between being true to themselves and being acceptable to others, between living fully and living safely, between authentic existence and institutional approval. The final words that Dr. Rossi read aloud to the assembled scholars and journalists seemed to speak directly across the centuries to everyone who had ever felt trapped by circumstances that denied their fundamental humanity. "I lived. I loved. I chose my own damnation rather than accept their salvation. I was Caterina, and I refused to be forgotten. Remember that a woman existed here who would not disappear, who would not be silenced, who would not accept that her intelligence and her heart were crimes deserving punishment rather than gifts deserving celebration." As the press conference concluded and the scholars dispersed to continue their analysis of the most remarkable archaeological discovery of the 21st century, Dr. Rossi remained alone in the chamber where Caterina had spent her final days transforming certain death into permanent victory. The walls that had been built to silence rebellion had instead preserved it. The stones that were meant to contain dangerous ideas had instead protected them. The tomb that was designed to erase memory had instead created immortality. The renovation of Santa Chiara was completed the following spring, but the building that emerged bore little resemblance to the institution that had once imprisoned unwilling daughters and enforced systematic submission through religious discipline. The hidden passages that Caterina had used for her network of relationships were preserved and illuminated as testament to human ingenuity in the face of oppression. The chamber where she died became a shrine not to religious martyrdom but to intellectual courage and authentic human dignity. Most significantly, the entire complex was transformed into the Caterina Research Institute, an international centre for studying women's resistance to patriarchal authority throughout history. Scholars from around the world came to study not just her individual case, but the broader patterns of female agency and rebellion that her testimony had helped illuminate. Her carved words became founding documents for new approaches to understanding how marginalized people had always found ways to claim dignity and authenticity, even within the most oppressive circumstances. On quiet evenings when the tourists had departed and the scholars had returned to their libraries, Dr. Rossi often found herself alone in Caterina's tomb, reading the carved words by candlelight and marveling at the power of human intelligence and determination to transcend even the most complete systems of control. The woman who had been buried alive as criminal and heretic had emerged 5 centuries later as prophet and pioneer, her rebellion transformed from individual transgression into universal inspiration. The bells of Santa Chiara, restored to working condition during the renovation, still rang the hours as they had for centuries, but now they marked time in a world where Caterina's voice could be heard by anyone willing to listen. Her words had survived the stones that were meant to silence them, her ideas had outlasted the institutions that were designed to suppress them, her rebellion had achieved immortality through the simple act of refusing to accept that authentic human existence was impossible within the constraints of an inauthentic world. "Remember me," her final carved words proclaimed to anyone who entered the chamber where she had chosen death over submission, authenticity over survival, truth over convenience. And in the 21st century, as women and men around the world continued to face choices between conformity and rebellion, between safety and authenticity, between institutional approval and individual dignity, her voice echoed with undiminished power. Remember that someone lived here who refused to disappear. The story that began with economic desperation forcing a young woman into unwanted religious life had ended with the creation of permanent testimony to the indestructible power of human intelligence and courage when applied to the eternal struggle for authentic existence within systems designed to prevent its achievement. Caterina's rebellion had failed in its immediate objectives, but succeeded in its ultimate purpose, proving that individual dignity was worth defending regardless of consequences, that authentic human relationships were worth pursuing despite their dangers, that the voice of truth could survive any attempt to silence it when carved deeply enough into stone by hands that refused to accept defeat as the price of their owner's integrity. 500 years after her death, Caterina's words continued to whisper from the walls to anyone who needed to hear that resistance was possible, that authentic life was achievable, that individual intelligence and determination could challenge any system of oppression, no matter how complete its apparent control. Her tomb had become not an ending but a beginning, not a monument to failure, but a foundation for future rebellions by anyone who shared her understanding that human dignity was not negotiable, and authentic existence was not optional for those who possessed the courage to claim it regardless of the cost. The end, for every woman whose story was buried alive, for every voice that refused to be silenced, for everyone who chooses authenticity over approval, truth over safety, love over law. Remember Caterina,